Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Throne of Heaven in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 56, Honor. When Renji stepped out of Chad's protection and declared that he would draw their opponent's attention to let Yoriyuki escape, he considered staying behind to help. However, he quickly decided that would be dishonoring the redhead's decision, and when he saw that the wind user had refocused his attack to target the escaping Yoriyuki, it was clear that helping her was the best choice to make here. He started running after her quickly, and a moment later, Izuru was at his side, the blonde man dragging a terrified Hanataro after them with one hand. He glanced forward, where Yoriyuki just turned into a cat to let a sphere of compressed air smash a crater in the wall above her, and then turned human again, just in time for a huge arm to slam down right in front of her, stopping her path. The moment she did, another arm seemed to appear out of the nearby alleyway, this one carrying a sword, and stabbing straight at Yoriyuki. However, while the appearance was so sudden and measured to be so close that Chad himself had no way to react and help, the woman's reactions time were much faster. She grinned, while the bell around her throat sent a pulse of Ryotsu as it rung, and both giant arms turned into what looked like the segmented limbs of a grasshopper. He didn't have much time to see them, however, as they disappeared immediately, only for two more human-shaped, giant ones to reappear and try to swat Yoriyuki between their hands, something the woman avoided with a jump that was powered by kangaroo legs before she let loose the power of her collar again to turn the limbs into those of another harmless creature. I see. Chad turned to Izuru at his side, and the man explained, with narrowed eyes. Captain Komamura's Shikai lets him summon a giant warrior, and he can decide to only summon the limbs. More importantly, he can dismiss them at will, and given their size, he can do it even from far away. It's a great counter to Captain Shihoin's Bankai. It seems Captain Kukaki put some serious thought when he put his team together. As if to confirm Izuru's words, a giant armor chest formed around Yoriyuki, trying to trap her in. This time, however, Chad was ready, as he called forth his gauntlet and let loose a beam of Ryotsu straight at the armor's helm. The hit smacked the helm back only a bit, but it was enough to keep it from reacting as Yoriyuki, in a small form that seemed to be glowing with electricity, darted out of the trap. Watch out! Hanataro's shout caused Izuru and Chad both to look behind their back, just in time to see a giant feet descending upon them. Thanks to the warning, however, Izuru struck upwards as he released his Shikai, and by making the feet light enough to easily push it away. A moment later, however, a different giant feet hit the ground, the tremor sending all three of them falling down. Meanwhile, Yoriyuki seemed to have grown giant butterfly wings, which she was using to fly through blast of cutting winds and the swings of a disembodied giant arm wielding a katana, her face concentrated in absolute focus. It was in part due to this, and in part due to how the fall had him watching upwards, that Chad was able to see what looked like a large number of spheres of black smoke falling toward a Yoriyuki who remained unaware of the danger. He fired one of his beams, and then focused his full bringer skill to keep it solid for the time needed to swipe the sky like a large bat, making sure to hit all the black projectiles. He had expected to make them explode, but what happened instead was that the beam cut through them, dispersing them into a dark mist that seemed to continue to hover above the battlefield. Izuru's gaze had followed the movement of Chad's beam, and he commented, sounding worried. And that's almost certainly Captain Tuan's power, which, alongside Captain Yodomaru's cutting wind, makes it 5 captains in total that are involved in this operation, considering how Captain Kukaki mentioned Captain Swafon. I don't think we can make it through that kind of force. Chad considered the matter as he slowly got up to his feet, and watched as Yoriyuki was assailed by 3 sides and was forced to take a glancing blow from a giant fist to avoid the giant swiping blade and the cutting winds. It seemed like a very desperate situation indeed, yet surrendering sat ill with him. If we work together, that might not be necessary. Izuru looked puzzled, so Chad elaborated. Their priority seems to be capturing Yoriyuki, not us. But she's strong enough. They need numbers to catch her. We might not get past them, but if we separate them, there is a chance. That caused the blonde Shinigami to gain a thoughtful expression, quickly followed by a decisive nod. Alright then, we need to let Yoriyuki get free from it first, and then try to escape ourselves once the enemies thin out a bit. Chad nodded along, then said, as a plan formed in his mind. Make me weightless. Izuru blinked, but obligingly tapped him with his sword. Chad swapped his protection to his leg and shot a beam out of it that propelled him forward as fast as a missile, so that he managed to get in front of Yoryuki without any of the others realized, just as she was about to be hit by another blast of compressed air. Instead, Chad tanked the hit with his gauntlet, and as the blast pushed him back, he swapped the protection to his leg again, using it to absorb the impact into the wall behind himself. Then, he charged a beam on his foot, but immediately before firing, he let the collected Ryotsu dissipate instead, filling the wall enough that he was able to use his Fullbringer ability to make it sticky, allowing him to stand attached to it like a spider. Meanwhile, thanks to his intervention, Yoryuki had been able to use his Bankai to once again turn the arms attacking into useless bug arts, and then used the temporary respite from the wind slices to suddenly gain a lot of elevation. When another arm tried to grab her mid-flight, it suddenly fell apart after being hit by a red laser from Hanataro, and when that caused the limb creator to focus on the two Shinigami on the ground, Izuru managed to smack one of the arms, punching at them into the other one by using his Shikai's power. Seeing that the other two were keeping the one creating the large limbs occupied, Chad refocused his attention on Yoryuki, who seemed to be doing fine with evading the wind attacks and getting away. However, he saw that another barrage of dark spheres were aiming for her. He could feel that his weight hadn't returned to him yet, so he sent himself flying higher with another beam from his feet, and then called on a gauntlet to swipe again the dark spheres again. However, this time he found that a number of spheres suddenly changed direction. Those that didn't, he destroyed like before, although this time they fell to the ground like black raindrops. The rest, however, homed in on him, clearly foregoing chasing Yoryuki completely in favor of trying to corner him. On one hand, that was good, as it meant he'd successfully diverted the attention of one of their opponents to himself, but on the other hand, it meant he now was going to need to fight a captain by himself, at least long enough to make good on his escape. And he had a set of black globes aimed straight at his face to contend with. Chad punched a beam their direction once again, but this time, the controller was ready to make them dodge, continuing their pursuit of him unerringly. However, the fact he was still weightless resulted in him being rebounded backwards by it, gaining more distance from the incoming projectiles. He was not expecting, however, for a giant foot to be falling onto him from above. When he shot it, the foot disappeared before he could hit it, and then reappeared later, close enough he barely had the time to put his gauntlet in the way as a shield. Still, the foot continued pushing him downwards, and Chad knew that, if he let himself be pushed down like this, even if the giant foot above him didn't hurt him, the impact with the ground would break all his bones. What he really needed was to protect his leg to absorb the impact from the landing, but without removing the gauntlet that was the only thing stopping him from being squashed, and Chad knew he didn't have the Ryotsu for both. However, he resolved to try anyway, as he couldn't see any alternative. The air wasn't saturated with enough Ryotsu for him to use his Fullbringer skills, and a glance told him that Izuru was desperately trying to use ripped chunk of weight-changed masonry to deflect the giant sword swiping at him, while Hanataro was laid out unconscious on the ground, so no help was coming from either of them. So Chad focused, and slowly started to push Ryotsu charged with the desire to protect through his pendant and to wrap around his leg. At first, he could feel that it was slowly starting to work, wrapping and solidifying around his leg, but it had reached just above his ankle. He couldn't pump any more to it, and he could feel it starting to try and take away what was around his arm. He resisted for a moment, but then realized he could direct the draining, and had it focus on the shoulder area. This slowly shortened the gauntlet so it was only covering up to his elbow, and in exchange for it, he managed to have enough that, while it didn't reach to his leg, what portion of it was there was at least fully formed. With a snap of will, he forced them to solidify, and while his gauntlet was left now only covering his forearm, he now found himself with an ankle boot around his foot, which was still enough to offer him the protection he needed. Just as he was about to smash the ground, he kicked out a beam that slowed his momentum, and as he did, he let the Ryotsu from that beam soak the ground, making it elastic. As a result, the ground gave slightly as he hit it, before bouncing back. Of course, the foot trying to crush him didn't disappear, and it was still pushing down with more strength than Chad could answer with, but with both his feet on the ground, he was able to kick a beam at it. The hit was enough to break the limb away, but before Chad had time to capitalize on it, black spheres smacked him on all sides, feeling like sticky sludge as they immediately enveloped him. The moment they did, his senses deserted him, he could no longer see or hear, and even the sense of the sludge pressure on his skin disappeared. He could feel his muscles, but as he tried to move them, the darkness offered resistance to it, likely because of its sludge consistency. And while his sense of balance remained, telling him he was still upright, he couldn't really tell anything about his surroundings either, with his tactile sensations completely shut off. Chad mused that the ability was similar to Urahara's, except instead of time dilation, it was focused on sensory deprivation. Otherwise, however, it seemed to allow for the creation of a number of projectiles the user could shape and direct to a certain extent. It also, Chad found, had a hole of sort. While he couldn't detect any Ryotsu around himself, he could still feel that which was inside of him, and control it, even if he didn't know how it was reacting with the outside world. But he didn't really need to know, his Fullbringer power merely relied on the feelings he himself sent out, all he needed to know was what surface he was affecting. And since his balance hadn't changed, he was still standing on the ground he'd made elastic before, and thus needed only to give it a push to be even more so again, and then use a beam from his foot to propel himself upwards. He felt the resistance to the push from the sludge-like consistency of the darkness it was into, but it wasn't enough to stop the amount of acceleration that the combination of the beam and the elastic ground underneath gave him. As he was sent flying, Chad could feel that some of the darkness had clung to his body, due to its sticky nature. However, now that he had a point of reference, it was easy to fill them with his own Ryotsu and change them to make them slide off his body instead. That was the least of his concerns, however, as he found himself face to face with what looked like a big armored giant, which he hurriedly had to punch himself away from with a beam straight to the giant's chest. Worryingly, unlike how he'd managed to destroy the other limbs, the chest resisted the impact easily, which told Chad that his opponent was perhaps more focused on him now. This was confirmed as, when he landed, he found himself in front of a hurriedly retreating Izuru. On the other side of the hallway was a tall Shinigami woman, with long blonde hairs and a curvaceous figure that would have made look soft and friendly in other circumstances, but was a straight contrast to the expression of hard determination on her face. She was swinging what looked like a sword without a blade, the crossguard shaped like a cat's head, which made him think the wave of glowing hot ashes that was easily eating through the barricade Izuru had made out of the floor's plating, incinerating the stone and turning them remains into more burning ashes, was the power of her Shikai. And it was clear Izuru was having his hands full just keeping her at bay. Some of his clothes and even the tip of his hairs were somewhat singed, he was sweating profusely, and there was a small, bleeding cut on the outside of his arm. Chad glanced at the woman, then asked Izuru, with a frown. "Another captain?" The blonde let out a short, nervous bark of laughter as he answered. "Oh, no, just the 10th Division's lieutenant, Rangiku Matsumoto. Not like it matters much, she's been a Shinigami far longer than me, and everybody knows fire element Shikai are the stronger type there is." While Chad thought that Izuru's words had been low enough, clearly the woman had better hearing, as she shouted back, in a serious tone. "If you know you're not going to win, just surrender. Whatever the madness is that caused you to do something this stupid, you will receive clemency if you admit your defeat." As if to confirm her words, the figure of the armored giant stepped up from behind them, the unconscious Hanataro inside his closed fist, while behind it, still quite distant but no longer so much that they couldn't be noticed, he could see two Shinigami with white Haori waiting. It seemed that, with Yoryuki's Bankai no longer a direct threat, some of their opponents didn't feel the need to continue striking from afar anymore. When they didn't immediately answer, Matsumoto gestured with her sword handle again, and a jet of ashes flew around the barrier Izuru had erected, heading straight for him. He guarded himself from the attack with his sword, batting the ashes away with a wide swing that caused them to fall to the ground due to their weight. It didn't, however, cause them to stop moving, and in fact Chad could see that they were incinerating the ground itself, turning it to even more ashes that Izuru had to step away from. While he was doing that, the woman charged, using Shunpo to jump toward a wall and from there to vault over Izuru's barrier. As she did, she extended her arm toward the ashes below, and a thin stream of it flew into the sword, reshaping itself into a blade as she went. Then she swung, and when Izuru went for a block, the blade turned to ashes that collected into the crossguard, folding on itself so that the bladeless handle continued the swing unimpeded. The blade reformed from the ashes when the attack was within Izuru's guard, and would have struck Izuru's face had Chad not fired a beam that blasted the woman to the side. It didn't take her out, however, it seemed like the beam from the Heft gauntlet was somewhat less powerful, and just before it could hit, she'd also had the ashes fan like a shield between herself and it. Matsumoto then used Hakuta to harden herself so fast that both the weakened beam and the impact on the wall only left her winded, like then seriously hurt. Then Chad had to focus on the giant as it swung his massive blade at him. He tried to stop it with a beam at first, but the sword cut through it, and only barely did he manage to roll out of the way of it. He frowned. It seemed the man was capable of applying the Shinigami ability to cut through things on his Zanpakuto to the one wielded by the giant as well. However, Chad wasn't about to let that stop him. Unlike the last enemy he'd faced who used such a trick, this one was only applying it to his blade, not to his whole body. That meant he could get around the ability. With a moment of focus, he tried something he'd never done before, and let his gauntlet dissipate to form a second ankle boot. Then, as he darted forward, he started to let Ryotsu overflow from them by charging beams on every step he took, and then letting them disperse rather than firing them. He had to dodge another 2 swings from the giant swordsman as he charged forward, which he managed by making the ground just a bit slippery and sliding along. Once he got between its legs, he slammed one into one of the legs of the giant, letting out a beam point blank. The impact didn't destroy it, but did left it unbalanced, and that was when Chad turned the ground under the other one into quicksand, causing the armor to sink into it to the ankle while he rolled out of it. Then, he summoned all of his Ryotsu back to have a full gauntlet covering his entire arm from fingers to shoulder, and charged up the most powerful beam he could, before firing it straight at the armor's head. With how imbalanced it already was, the hit was enough to cause the giant to fall down, and just as it was about to hit the ground, Chad knelt and turned all of it into quicksand for a moment, before turning it back solid once the armor was sunk deeply into it, trapping it within. He slowly got up and turned toward the huge presence he could feel at his back, even as the giant armor disappeared behind him, causing the ground to crumble on itself in a cloud of dust and debris as a result. The man was taller than Chad and thus able to look down on him, something he rarely got to experience. The effect was enhanced by the conical and striped helmet he was wearing, with only a thin slit in it from which it was impossible to see the man's eyes. His voice, however, was clear, if deep. "You have proven capable, young man, but you cannot possibly hope to defeat me." Chad didn't let any of his worry out, merely saying, in the usual matter-of-fact tone he reserved for his enemies, "I defeated your giant once already. I'll do it again, as many times as needed." There was a pause, as if the man was considering his words, and then said, "I do not detect dishonesty in your words. You truly believe in your strength, and are ready to test it out. That is honorable, and to prove you I respect that, I'll show you what you would be facing, rather than simply forcing you to keep fighting until your force is spent. Observe my Bankai, bring ruination, Tenkan." Chad took a step back instinctively, as he felt his opponent Ryotsu surge forward with an incredible pressure. A moment later, a differently armored giant appeared behind the Shinigami captain, one much larger and more menacing. Then, a second formed, and a third, and when they stopped, while Chad had lost count, he was pretty sure it was at least 3 dozens. The captain spoke again, his tone more serious. "I am Seijin Komamura, captain of the 7th Division of the Godi I-13, and offer you once again the chance to surrender honorably, proud warrior. You might be able to keep defeating my iron giants if you face them one by one, but should I command them to all strike together, you would fall without fail. Recognize this, and no dishonor shall befall you, for it is no warrior he who does not know his own strength. Also, in case it helps, I have your friend beaten, and if you keep fighting, he might get hurt for real." Chad and Komamura both turned toward Matsumoto, who was standing with a feet on the back of Izuru's head. The male Shinigami was face down on the ground, moaning in pain, his Zanpakuto a bit of distance from his hand, while the woman also had her sword in a state of half-hardened and half-ashen, such that it was pinning all of Izuru's limbs at once, and whenever he moved too much, some of the ashes would graze his clothes and burn little bit off them. Matsumoto herself, meanwhile, looked particularly relaxed, and aside from the small bruise from Chad's own beam, seemed like getting her hairs in a bit of disarray was all the damage she'd taken in the duel, and something she was using her free hand to fix. Apparently, her attitude left Komamura a bit annoyed, as there was a hint of reproach in his voice when he addressed her. "Lieutenant, to hold somebody hostage to force an opponent to surrender is not honorable behavior." The blonde didn't seem fazed, smiling for a moment before she went for a confused expression, putting a finger to her mouth. "You sure about that? I could swear Captain Ichimaru told me it was the best way to force somebody to surrender. Maybe I misunderstood his instruction." The long pause following seemed to suggest that Komamura wanted to object, but wasn't sure how to do so without insulting another captain. Before he could find the right words, however, a new voice intruded in the situation, cold and unyielding. "Enough playing around. Seijin, you offered the boy his chance, it's time to force the issue." Chad looked upwards, where a new man wearing the white haori of a captain had landed on a nearby rooftop. He was dark-skinned, his hair's braided, he was wearing an orange scarf and a pair of reflective white sunglasses, and his expression was an uncompromising one. Komamura let out a long breath, then turned toward Chad, who quickly raised both of his hands, letting the gauntlet around the right one dissipate as he said, loud and clear, "I surrender." Komamura nodded, the gesture clearly appreciative, while Matsumoto pouted, as if disappointed she wouldn't get to continue the fight. The last arrival, however, frowned, and jumped down with elegance, landing in front of Chad before saying, as he pointed a finger at him, "We can't be sure that he's being honest without making sure he's not hiding something on his person." Then, before Chad could react, the man let out a wave of powerful Ryotsu that seemed to fill every single corner of his soul. It was unpleasant and deeply invasive, even if the effect disappeared quickly. The man was left frowning, and muttering to himself, so low Chad barely managed to hear, and probably wouldn't have if they'd been any less closer. "Nothing, so either the cat, or one of the two visored." Chad filed the information for thinking it over later, and then quickly asked, annoyed, "What was that?" "A check for items hidden within one's soul, a search that Captain Tuan was not entitled to undertake." Everybody turned toward Rukia's brother, the man walking forward with a confident stride. Captain Tuan, as Byakuya had identified him, turned toward the newcomer and said, annoyed, "I was merely making sure that he wasn't carrying anything he might use to free himself once incarcerated, considered how quickly he surrendered to us. That was not for you to decide. I agreed to Captain Swafon's suggestion of including you in this operation under the agreement that you would only attack Shihoin, and not interact with the others in any way. Didn't you agree to that as well?" Tuan didn't look at all intimidated, despite the deep disapproval that could be felt heavily in Byakuya's Ryotsu, which had filled the area following his arrival. "I was in the presence of Captain Komamura and Lieutenant Matsumoto, surely no foul play would have been possible, unless you are doubting their integrity as well as my own. That is immaterial to the fact you did not follow the rules you had agreed to. You shall have no further contact with the prisoners." Tuan scoffed, but turned to leave, with Komamura following him. Meanwhile, Byakuya turned toward Matsumoto. "Lieutenant Abarai is left at the site of battle, wounded but still alive. Please collect him, Lieutenant, and then have him, as well as your prisoner and the unconscious boy there, be brought to the confinement areas of the 4th Division, that their wounds might be treated. I shall take charge of the last prisoner myself." The blonde nodded, and Byakuya only seemed to acknowledge it by letting his Ryotsu gain a certain sense of approval, before motioning for Chad to follow him. Only once they were alone did the man ask, in a serious tone, "What is it that Tuan was looking for?" He searched Rukia in the same manner when she came back, as if he was sure she would have something hidden on herself, and seemed surprised when she didn't. Chad considered the words the other captain had muttered to himself, and then said, "A powerful item. Probably what Aizen was killed for, and certainly the thing which Rukia was sent to our world to retrieve. In the wrong hands, it could destroy Soul Society." Byakuya stopped suddenly at receiving such a complete answer. Even if his Ryotsu didn't betray any emotion and his face didn't show it, Chad was sure he'd managed to surprise the man. After a moment, Byakuya asked, in a whisper, "What is it, and where is it?" But Chad shook his head at that. "I have no reason to tell that to somebody who will let his innocent sister be killed. But if Tuan is looking for it, that means he is working with Jin. Let my friends know that, and maybe they will give you your answer." Byakuya actually frowned at that, his Ryotsu filling with disapproval, but Chad didn't let himself be intimidated and, after a moment, they resumed their walk, the silence heavy between them. Chapter 57, Deal. Ichigo couldn't say that he had slept well as he woke up on the cave's floor. The only positive aspect of it was that he had slept, at least, since he'd been horribly tired after the fight with Kenpeki. Still, having to do it on bare rock had not been pleasant, and while he had been the one to suggest they let the still unconscious Shinigami girl with them have the only futon Urahara had left in the cave, he'd still found the time to chastise the man about not storing more. Of course, Urahara had merely shrugged the critic away by saying he wasn't expecting to have guests around when he created these safe houses, but that didn't leave Ichigo any less annoyed with him. He could, of course, also acknowledge that venting at Urahara was a way to relieve his tension and worry over Tatsuki's fate. He was torn by the feeling of guilt at leaving her behind, and guilt at not trusting her promise to make good on her escape. Having Urahara as somebody to be angry at, even if in an insignificant way and for insignificant reason, was perhaps the only reason he'd been able to sleep at all. Still, as he looked around the area, he found that Urahara wasn't visible. He assumed the scientist was using the small chute that was the only way to enter the refuge to communicate with Yoryuki. Ichigo wasn't clear on the specifics, but Urahara had assured him that, while the entirety of the refuge was shielded from detection, the entrance chute allowed for some form of external communication that the rest of the cave blocked. With a sigh, he went to collect some food from the nearby cupboard, the only piece of furniture in the whole cavern. While thinking over what they should be doing next, he wanted to ask after Tatsuki, but considering how his friend neither knew nor had any way to find their current hiding place, he knew that wouldn't be very likely, regardless of whether she'd escaped or not. It was maddening. You shouldn't let yourself be consumed by doubts, Ichigo. You will need all of your focus if you want to succeed, and doubting yourself will make that harder. Ichigo countered with the thought that believing in himself too strongly could easily lead to missing important things if they didn't fit with his beliefs. He wanted to win because it saved Rukia and the rest of his friends and because it was the right thing to do, not just because he'd be happier if he won. Zanjitsu seemed to be considering the point, but before the sword spirit could answer, a sudden shout of confusion and surprise drew his attention to the futon, where the girl had suddenly awoken with a start. He could see her hurriedly patting herself down to check for wounds, obviously confused when she failed to find any, and then suddenly noticing the Zanpakuto laying at her side, reaching for it immediately and gripping it with an expression of relief and peace that Ichigo understood immediately. He knew what it was like, to be separated from something that was pretty much a piece of your soul. Not wanting to scare her, Ichigo decided to speak up, so she would realize he was around. "Hi. How are you doing?" The girl was startled. Before turning toward Ichigo with a suspicious, fearful gaze, he smiled in an attempt to come off as more friendly, and offered her one of the sealed packs of junk foods that seemed to be the only kind of ration Urahara had stored away. "Hungry?" She hesitantly took the pack from his hands, but didn't open it, eyeing it hesitantly before turning the same gaze onto him. Could you tell me your name?" "Ichigo Kurosaki, and you're Rukia's friend, Momo Hinamori, right?" The girl nodded, and then her eyes widened as she said, "Oh. I know your name, Rukia told me you helped her in the mortal realm." Ichigo grinned, and answered. "Izuru said so as well. Honestly though, she's the one who deserves praise for coming up with the strategy, we just gave her a hand putting it into practice." Momo grinned back at that. "She's always been good at coming up with plans, yes." Then, the girl paused, looking around at the cave around them, and asked in curiosity. "So, where are we?" "Underground, apparently, some sort of safe house. We're hiding from the Godai 13. "Hiding? So, you saved me." She let out a relieved breath, then frowned as she glanced around and asked. "But then, where is everybody?" "We got separated during the breakout. Renji, Izuru, and Chad should be hiding at Hanataro's home." "Hanataro? He's a friend of Izuru, a Shinigami medic. He's the one that healed you. You were wounded pretty badly when we found you." "Yeah, I got struck by." Fear suddenly returned to her face with a vengeance, and she hurriedly asked, her breath itching. "What of Toshiro? Did Izuru take him too? How was he?" Ichigo was left dumbfounded by the question. It took him a moment to place the name as that of a friend of theirs that Izuru had mentioned, but said he was too visible for them to involve him. If Hinamari's worry was anything to go by, she'd not shared Izuru's opinion, and took the initiative of involving this Toshiro guy on her own. Probably without much success, if her worry was anything to go by. He would have liked to reassure the girl, but he wasn't about to lie to an ally, so he had to answer, with a grimace. We didn't find anybody else in the courtyard. I don't know where your friend might be. Then he might be, and all because I. She trailed off, and it was obvious she was just about to break into tears at the idea her friend might be dead, so Ichigo leaned forward and hurried to say. Come on, don't fall apart now, we don't know what happened, he might still be fine. But what if he isn't? Well, if he did, he wouldn't want you to give up, right? To leave your other friends on their own. He wasn't sure where the words had come from, he'd just been trying to keep the girl from breaking into tears, nothing more. However, as he spoke them, Ichigo realized they applied to him just as much as Momo. As worried as he was about Tatsuki's fate, he couldn't let that stop him from saving Rukia, or he'd be betraying both friends. Meanwhile, his words seemed to have helped Momo calm down a bit, as the girl smiled and said, in a friendly tone. You know, that's almost the same thing Orium told me. I guess Rukia really knows how to pick her friends. Ichigo chuckled at that. Yeah, finding the right words to help people has always been one of Orium's talents. Then he paused, realizing what they were just talking about. Wait. You met Orium? Momo nodded, and seeing the clear surprise Ichigo knew had to be showing in his eyes, she explained. She and your other friend, Urayu Ishida, were with the Lady Shihoin when we met. They said they wanted to reach the Central 46 and get them to declare Rukia innocent, but I don't know what happened afterwards. That was very worrisome, but Ichigo consoled himself with the idea that a lack of success did not mean that they had failed, merely that, much like Ichigo's own group, they might have experienced a setback. He let out a long breath, then answered. Well, I don't know either, but they weren't arrested the way you and Renji were, so they should be safe. Momo nodded along. I hope they are, they seemed like nice people, I'd be sad if somebody happened to them. Thank you. Thing lapsed into silence after that. Ichigo was unsure how to continue the conversation, and it seemed like Momo was just as uncertain. After a moment, she gave a long look around and said, in a sad tone. I suppose it'd be silly to hope there's a oven hidden in here somewhere, isn't it? Ichigo blinked. While it wasn't on par with one of Orium's usual non sequitur, it was a weird enough comment that he felt he really had to ask. What would you do with a oven? Momo let out a long breath, her hands fidgeting absently with the pack in her hands as she answered. Bake some cookies. It helps me relax, and it would be much healthier than eating this stuff. If it helps, I only took those because I was in a hurry when I was setting this place up, and if I could choose, I would definitely go for your cookies over it. I've heard it said that they're delicious. Ichigo turned toward the just-arrived Urahara, eager to ask him if he had any news of Tatsuki, and if not at least what the others had been planning, but the question died on his lips as he saw that he was supporting a clearly hurt Yoriyuki, the dark-skinned woman's arm slung over his shoulder showing several bruises and the clothes sporting multiple cuts, even if Ichigo could see they were only shallow, glancing ones. She also had a sword swung behind her back, and Ichigo realized this was the first time he'd seen her with her Zanpakuto in its sealed state, which was as clear an indicator of how tired she was as any. Momo let out a gasp of surprise of her own, then got up and hurried to help Urahara as she shouted. Lady Shihoin. What happened? Yoriyuki let out a wheezing chuckle as she answered. Byakuya was smarter than I gave him credit for, using the new ability of turning his sword into a swarm to attach a shard to me to track me down, and then sprung an ambush on me with 4 other captains and about 3 divisions worth of Shinigami. She allowed herself a small smug smile as she added. And all he managed to do was leave me a bit tired and scrapped. He still couldn't catch me. As they laid her down on the futon, Ichigo couldn't help but think that, impressive as that sounded, Yoriyuki was perhaps feeling more smug than warranted. He quickly pushed that to the side however, and instead asked, letting his worry through. What of Chad and the others? Yoriyuki grimaced, and perhaps a part of that was pain, but a moment later she made it clear it was not just that as she said. They got arrested, they decided to stay behind to let me get away. Then she reached for his hand, gripping it as she added. I didn't sacrifice them, I promise you that. They asked me to, and if I need to die to save your friends, I will. I haven't forgotten what you asked of me, I promise. Ichigo felt conflicted, but didn't let that show, merely nodding, even if he was not fully certain that Yuriuki really had changed her mind on the matter of necessary sacrifices. He was willing to give her a chance to prove her words. After a moment, she let go of his arm and slipped into unconsciousness, and Urahara said, in a serious tone. Right, we might want to let her sleep while we help her recover. I think setting up a recovering array to collect Ryotsu from the air could help her get better faster. Wouldn't a set of condensers be a superior choice? Urahara turned to Momo with surprise, and then asked. How do you suppose to keep the Reishi stable if we do that? By destabilizing the draining area first, then the collection will do the work of stabilizing it by itself. Urahara looked intrigued by that, as he asked. And what about the potential explosive reaction that could cause? Momo raised her finger with a self-assured grin. Ah, you're talking about the emotional drifting of atmospheric Reishi. I've read your work on it, it was incredibly innovative. But see, since you left, we found a workaround to that problem. It was one of my first successful projects, in fact. She then paused, thoughtful, as she added. Although, I'm not sure how well that would work when applied to an area that is under the kind of interference array that would be required to keep the area undetectable. Urahara grinned in self-satisfaction as he answered. And what if I told you that the defenses I've set up here aren't based around an interference array? It was at that point that Ichigo shook his head and tuned them out. It seemed clear the two inventors were doing some sort of scientific bonding of sort, and Ichigo couldn't really contribute to that in any meaningful manner. What he could do, however, was prepare for the task ahead. Thus, he sat himself down with his Zanpakuto in his lap and closed his eyes, opening them to find himself under the light drizzle that characterized his inner world. He took a breath in, and as he did, Ichigo realized that he was feeling slightly different. Upon checking himself, he found that it was because, while he was still in his usual clothes, he now had a belt with both his Zanpakuto and an unbroken version of the Auswool attached to it. Zanjitsu, who was standing tall to the side, smiled at his surprise in that wry manner of his, and explained. You've come to recognize that the swords are a part of yourself, so now you are always carrying them along in your mind. Ichigo raised an eyebrow at that. I thought you said it was very rare for one's mindscape to change. The old man shook his head in amusement. I only said that it's difficult and that it takes a serious shift in personality. It's rare in the sense it doesn't happen often and it can almost never be done willingly, but it does happens. Ichigo let out a long breath, then nodded and smiled, feeling a bit more secure in himself. In a sense, for what he had planned, having his full power right at hand felt very appropriate. Then he turned fully to his Zanpakuto spirit and said, in a serious tone. I'll need you to support me in this. I don't think I can do it alone, and we need to present a united front if this is to work. Zanjitsu looked thoughtful, and for a moment, Ichigo worried. He only realized he'd been holding his breath when the old man nodded and said, with decision. I shall trust you on this, Ichigo. I hope you know what you're doing. Ichigo hoped the same, even as he took the lead in descending the stairs into the dark room where Shiro was waiting, wrapped in constantly glowing red chains. Ichigo frowned at that. If the symbolism was consistent, then the hollow should have been in deep pain from that, and also in the process of trying to break out somehow, but Ichigo couldn't feel anything of the sort, and the hollow was standing still. It did, however, grinned when they entered, and asked, in its usual amused tone. So, here to force some answers out of me? Or have you found some way to steal my power? Ichigo shook his head. I don't need to do that. In fact, I don't even need to keep you confined anymore. Answering to his will, the chains disappeared, leaving Shiro dumbfounded. The hollow turned a thoughtful gaze on him and commented. You realize you don't have that immunity to my influence on you anymore, right? I could simply kill you right now to take over. That was when Zanjitsu stepped out of the shadows. No, you couldn't, because I would stop you. Shiro frowned, crossing his arms. Ah, I see how it is. Back to the usual then, with the Zanpakuto doing the work of keeping you safe. Actually, I was hoping to set up a deal with you. Ichigo's words caught the hollow by surprise once more, which he was happy with. He wanted to keep it somewhat unbalanced. I want us to work together, like we did when we saved Tatsuki. Shiro scoffed. And why should I care? Or why would you even need to ask? You can just force me to do it, after all. Because I don't want to divide my attention with keeping you on a leash at the same time I'm fighting. I want us to fight together, so we can concentrate our strength. I think that'll make us more powerful, and that might be the only way to defeat the opponent we'll be facing. Whatever opponent you happen to have is really of no interest to me at all. Ichigo affected some fake surprise of his own at that. I thought you wanted to pay back Byakuya for the humiliation he inflicted us both. That caught the hollow attention. You think you will be facing him? I know I will. He is the one who took Rukia away. He managed to outsmart Yoriyuki, and to hear her and Renji speak of him, he's stronger even than the average captain, which considering how strong the other two captains I fought were, is no small thing. He's going to be there to stop us, you can count on it, and when he does, either we're ready for that fight, or he'll win again. He could see a certain interest glinting in the hollow's glowing golden gaze, but the creature was not yet fully persuaded, as it countered. That might give me some fleeting satisfaction, but I don't know that it's enough to justify helping my captor do anything. Why shouldn't I simply wait for when the man is about to kill you, and you need to beg for my help, and make some serious concessions in exchange for it? In answer, Ichigo merely raised his hand, the Hujioku appearing between his fingers as simply as him willing it to be there. The hollow's gaze immediately focused on the sphere of roiling darkness, and Ichigo answered, his tone deadly serious. Because, if you work with me, so that we can come up with a plan right now, and you help me willingly, I'll let you have access to this power. I won't let you have full control over it, but you said that this was in hollow, and that I've not been providing you with proper meals. Help me willingly, teach me how to use the abilities of this thing in battle, and I'll let you feed off of it. Ichigo could feel the Reisu of the hollow filling with greed and hunger at the mere idea, and knew the hollow was hooked. The creature's answer afterwards was only a formality. And how, exactly, do you plan for us to work together? Ichigo shrugged, and said. By simply discussing exactly what sort of power this would give you, and how best to use it. Once I know what it can do, we can come up with a plan that can lead us to victory. Shiro offered one of his most threatening grins yet, and Ichigo could do no more than hope he wasn't making a big mistake with this. However, after seeing how much everybody else was willing to do to ensure their efforts succeeded, to keep playing it safe any longer would be as if to say he wasn't as committed to the success of their mission as the rest of them. And he wasn't willing to do that. All of his friends had made sacrifices to make it here, and were counting on him to see this through. He would not delude them. Chapter 58, Friendship. While Mr. Yucatake was a very nice host and his house was quite pretty, Orium was not happy with having to wait in it doing nothing while her friends were out there, doing their best. The chance to sleep safely after the fight with Nemu and her dad had been nice, but now, she felt like they weren't doing all they could to help Rukia, especially with the latest news Shukuro had just revealed them. Urayu, judging from his frown, wasn't happy either as he said. And you are sure all of these people who were arrested with Sato are allies, Tsukishima? Shukuro nodded. I am. Renji Aburai is a childhood friend of the Lady Kukaki, in addition to being lieutenant of the 6th Division, and both him and Izuru Kira are friends of both the Lady Kukaki and Momo Hinamori. I don't know what the relation of Hanataro Yamada to them all is, but seeing as they were hiding in his house, I suspect he's also an ally. And I already mentioned that yesterday night somebody broke Aburai out of prison, alongside with Miss Hinamori and Kisukira Hara, both of whom are still at large. It seems clear they are all working together. Do we have any idea of what they're going to do to them, now that they've caught them again? Not really, at least at this moment. Mr. Yucatake let out a long, tired breath. From what Orium understood, he was recovering from the magic medicines he'd finished taking the previous day, and explained, in his usual polite, patient tone. Since they are attempting to interfere with the deliberation of the Central 46, any discussion of their actions, or punishment for them, will be delayed until after the sentence has been carried out. The laws is structured this way so that disruptive actions cannot be used to delay a process indefinitely. For us, that means that we don't need to worry about anything been done to them as long as Rukia is alive. So, we should focus on saving her first, since the others won't be in immediate danger. Is that what you mean? Mr. Yucatake nodded to that, which gave Orium sudden hope that they would be doing just that immediately. Thus she asked, happy at finally being able to help her friends. So we're going to talk with your commander now, right? That way, we can sort this all out. Before anybody could answer, Shukuro spoke up, his tone serious. Actually, I think we should wait. Orium's head swiveled toward the dark-haired man, she puffed her cheeks, glare in full force as she asked, before anybody else could. What? Why? Shukuro raised his hands in a pacifying gesture, and his tone was apologetic as he answered. Because of the risk. Orium didn't care about risks when it was about saving her friends, and judging from their looks, none of the other people, Urayu, Miss Ise, Mr. Yuka-take and Mr. Shunsui, did either. The latter leaned forward a bit and spoke in the lackadaisical tone that was typical to him, and which Orium wasn't sure what to think about. On the one hand, the calm tones often felt soothing, on the other, they suggested an unwillingness to act that she was a bit annoyed by, with how urgent the situation was. Still, this time he was at least focused on the right thing, as he asked, "What do you mean, Lieutenant Tsukishima?" Talking with the captain commander was never going to be a fully safe choice, and delaying the talk is not going to make it more so. I know that, and I'm not saying I'm no longer willing to take the risk. But if we do it right now, and fail, then we'll just be neutralized ourselves, while putting those who wish for the Lady Kukaki's execution on even greater alert. But if we wait for the moment of the execution, then, should diplomacy fail, we would at least be able to keep the captain commander occupied and delay his ability to interfere with any actions that those of Lady Kukaki's friends who are still at large might attempt. And I think we can all agree that some attempt from them at the time of the execution is almost certain. Orium was left perplexed by Shukuro's explanation. A grave, worried silence seemed to have fallen over the rest of the group, so Orium took it on herself to ask for an explanation. Why can't we just help Ichigo and the others doing whatever they decide to do to save Rukia later on anyway if the old man tells us no today? Because if he doesn't believe us, the captain commander will have us all arrested, so we won't be able to interfere. Orium was genuinely surprised at that, her eyes going wide. This made no sense to her. But we'd just be explaining the truth. Even if he doesn't like it or doesn't believe it, he can't throw us in prison just for that. Talking isn't a crime. Shukuro offered a wry smile and said, "Fighting several Shinigami the way you and Ishida here did is, however, he could imprison you for that." Orium huffed. That made sense, even if it was totally unfair, since they'd only fought because they were trying to prevent an injustice, which she didn't think should be punished, since then evil people would go and do more unjust things, knowing nobody was allowed to stop them. But Nimue had been clear these Shinigami types were completely wrong-headed about laws, thinking that people should protect it, instead of the other way around and be protected by it. But that only applied to her and Urayu, maybe Shukuro, if Nimue had spotted him at the end of their fight. Even with that, the sooner we talk with the old man and persuade him, the sooner Rukia goes free. And even if we fail, Mr. Yuka-take and Mr. Shunsui didn't commit any crimes, so even if we get arrested, they could still help Ichigo and the others save Rukia later anyway, right? I'm afraid that's not so, Miss Inu. She turned toward the silver-haired Mr. Yuka-take, who was shaking his head as he explained. If we so directly support your opinion, then we'll be seen as your accomplices. But you didn't commit any crimes, it's like in a spy movie, you only brought the witness to your boss. I thought finding out the truth was part of your job. How can you be arrested for doing it right? There was sadness on Mr. Yuka-take's face at her words, while Mr. Shunsui looked more resigned. The captain commander would say that the role of Shinigami is to protect and enforce the law, not try to change it. He's always been very insistent that doing so would be an abuse of our power, and he didn't found the Godai 13 to steal the power of the 46 families. Any actions against them would rise his ire. Orium was left speechless by that, before her anger made her puff her cheeks again as she commented, letting her annoyance be clear in her voice. That's so stupid. It wasn't that Orium couldn't see the reasoning, she could even see how it made sense. That didn't make it better, however. Nimue was a robot, so maybe she couldn't, but the rest of these Shinigami were people, and the whole point of being a person was to be able to see when something wasn't working, and find a way to fix it. And speaking wasn't a fight, speaking was the way fights were avoided. That somebody would consider speaking out to be wrong made no sense to her, since if nobody pointed out mistakes, how could they ever be corrected? Yet, apparently, people here weren't willing to do even that. You of course realize that your plan for delaying the captain commander might mean having to actually fight against him, Lieutenant Tsukishima. The man nodded, a determined glint in his eyes, his hand gripping the handle of his sword. Of course, I'm not afraid, and if such a confrontation has to take place, I won't hesitate to join it. The honesty in his voice was so genuine, it lifted Orium's spirit somewhat. As her gaze moved to the others and saw that, each in their own way, they were all equally ready to fight for justice, Uriah grimly, Mr. Yuka sadly, Mr. Shunsui somberly, and Miss Ise tensely, her annoyance evaporated, and she smiled. Even if not everybody was willing to speak up, as long as a few good people were, things would get better, she was sure of it. Shikuro's declaration seemed to have let the others with little else to say, but Miss Ise, who to Orium seemed the most tense, asked after a moment, turning toward Mr. Shunsui. So, should we come up with a strategy, Captain? We'll need one to survive if the captain commander decides to fight us, won't we? Orium was confused for a moment, as she tried to recall what she knew of the Shinigami's old man leader, then frowned as Mistress Yoriyuki's explanation came back to her. Why is it that we need a special plan? Miss Ise's head snapped toward Orium, disbelief written on her features. She seemed both confused and outraged, perhaps. Orium wasn't sure, but she wasn't happy, that much was clear. You've been trying to rush us up, and don't even know what facing the captain commander would entail. Orium's surprise at Miss Ise's anger disappeared at that. If she thought Orium wasn't paying attention, it made sense she might be angry. She hurriedly waved her hands in front of herself to stop the other girl from jumping to conclusions, and quickly explained. Oh, no. I know his power, he can make fires and call forth a lot of zombies, right? Which was the point really, Orium blinked, scratching her chin in confusion as she went on. I'm just not sure why that's so big a problem. The Hollows are evil ghosts, and everybody knows ghosts are tougher than zombies. It was one of the most important rules of horrors, vampires were at the top, then ghosts, and zombies were the weakest. Well, unless one counted skeletons, but that was more like a skinny zombie than its own things. But Orium shook her head and slapped her cheeks quickly to push the thought away, skeleton or zombie, it didn't matter much, and her point still stood. At least, she thought so. Miss Ise didn't seem to agree, in fact, she was almost fuming as she said. He can summon every enemy his sword has ever burned, and he's the oldest Shinigami in all of Soul Society. He can summon a literal army. Orium nodded happily, clapping her hands together. She wasn't sure why Miss Ise was so angry, but perhaps she just had forgotten one detail that Orium remembered quite clearly due to the stress that happened to Orium all the time. Thus, she hurried to say. I know. And Mistress Yoriyuki said every captain has a power that can defeat an entire army, and since both Mr. Yuka and Mr. Shunsui are captains, that means we'll have two. So, defeating just one army should be easy, right? Miss Ise seemed completely dumbfounded at that, which Orium could sympathize with, as that was also how she often felt whenever somebody remembered her of some detail or other that she'd forgotten. It was embarrassing, because her memory was actually quite good, but sometimes some things were just so boring or uninteresting she had trouble keeping them in mind. She wasn't sure how best to reassure Miss Ise that she shouldn't worry. It would be embarrassing for the other girl if she simply said it directly, but before she could figure the best way to reassure the other girl and help her calm down, Mr. Shunsui had moved behind Miss Ise and placed both of his hands on her shoulder in what Orium recognized as a comforting, reassuring gesture. She looked up at him with a new appreciation for the man. He'd seemed so lazy, but apparently he could be very kind when the people he cared about needed him. That raised Orium's opinion of the captain by a lot. After all, the lesson that it didn't matter how unusual or different somebody might act, it was no big deal so long as they cared about other people, had been one of the first Sora had ever taught her, and was very dear to her heart. If Mr. Shunsui was like that, then he was worthy of respect to her. The man had been focusing on his subordinate, and after a few seconds, it seemed that his presence had helped Miss Ise calm down, the other girl's posture relaxing and her body going less stiff as she let out a long breath. Only then did he move his gaze to meet Orium's eyes with his own placid expression and friendly smile. Miss Inu, what Nanao meant to say was that the army the captain commander can summon is somewhat harder to put down than most others. Although I, of course, appreciate your confidence in our abilities. Orium wasn't sure what to make of that, but before she had the time to think it over too much, the man continued, sounding genuinely curious. So, if myself and Jushiro are to deal with the army, what about the fire? There's going to be a lot of that being thrown around, if things really devolve into a fight. Orium smiled. This one was an easy question to answer. The first time my friend Tatsuki lost control of her inner hollow, she was throwing around a lot of fire too, but Ichigo was so cool, he defeated her all on his own, and there was also that multiplying hollow attacking him at the same time. Of course, Ichigo is the best, but if we all work together, it shouldn't be too hard. She nodded with conviction as she finished saying that, as amazing as Ichigo was, Orium knew that she and Uriah were both good enough to make winning possible, especially if the fire was all they had to worry about. As she looked around, she could see that the Shinigami had been left speechless. She wasn't sure why, since that Ichigo was amazing shouldn't really surprise anyone, but before she could ask, Uriah commented, a smile on his lips. I suppose that's at least a good starting point, isn't it? Break down what the enemy can do, figure out countermeasure as best as possible, and be ready to deploy them. Uriah's words seemed to help the others relax, as Mr. Yukatake nodded and said, it is, if nothing else, as good a place as any to start. Orium grinned. It was nice to see everybody ready to work together now. Miss Ise even bowed, to Orium's utter surprise, and said, I apologize for my earlier outburst, Miss Inu. I let my fear get the better of me. Orium waved her hands in front of herself, saying, it was nothing, really. As she tried to stop the other girl from bowing to her, she had done nothing to deserve it, and nothing Miss Ise had done was worth apologizing for either. Trying to think of something that would help make the thing less awkward, Orium's gaze landed on the sword at her side, and she was struck by inspiration as she remembered how Ichigo had once mentioned that practicing his martial arts always helped him relax. So, she turned to Miss Ise and said, hoping it would help the dark-haired girl calm down. Maybe we could train together a bit? Feeling better prepared might help keeping the fear at bay. The other girl blinked, then pushed her glasses a bit back up her nose and commented. That's an agreeable idea. Orium smiled, clapping her hands together, and then accompanied the other girl to a separate room, where they could train without disturbing the conversation. Orium was honestly a bit excited at the possibility. She hadn't made much headway in connecting with the Zanpakuto she was carrying, and was hoping that having an actual Shinigami teach her how to do it. Thus, she followed Miss Ise's movements as she sat with her legs crossed, unsheathing her sword and placing it across her lap, with both hands over the flat of the blade, and closed her eyes. After a few moments of silence, Orium peeked out of one eye to see if she was missing something, but Miss Ise seemed to just be standing there, her breath regular but otherwise not doing anything particular. Orium closed her eyes again and tried to focus her spiritual senses to see if she could understand what the other girl was doing, but other than the fact her Ryutsu felt very calm and relaxed and her sword was enveloped by it, nothing particular jumped up to Orium's eyes. She tried to do the same, letting her Ryutsu envelop her, which was easy, and then trying to push it to envelop the sword in her lap, only for the Zanpakuto to repel it, the push being useless. That made her annoyed, which resulted in the Ryutsu around her ruffling itself in answer, which just added to it. She was ready to try again, since giving up would just annoy her more, but then she paused. After all, she had an expert right in front of herself, so she could simply ask how to do it correctly. It was really very simply, when one actually thought of it, and Orium was always confused when she saw people who thought it was somehow complicated or difficult to just ask for help when she couldn't do something. Nodding to herself, Orium turned to her training companion. Miss Ise? The other girl didn't open her eyes, and in fact her Ryutsu didn't even flicker, which Orium was very impressed by, but she did answered, sounding quite friendly. You can just call me Nanao, Miss Inu. Oh, then you should definitely call me Orium. Nanao, how exactly are you keeping your Zanpakuto from pushing your Ryutsu away? That caused the other girl to open her eyes and look at Orium with a perplexed expression. What do you mean? I mean, whenever I try to push my Ryatsu onto it, it bounces off. Orium demonstrated, once again trying to envelop the Zanpakuto with her Ryatsu only for it to slide down the blade without sticking to it, to which she pouted in annoyance, before turning toward Nanao and saying, "You see." The other girl's eyes had widened, and she slowly nodded before asking, "You don't have a connection to your Zanpakuto? No access to a Shikai?" The question left Orium puzzled, even as she shook her head and answered, "No, I don't, but I'm going to keep trying until I manage to get it." "But, you said you fought and hold your own against Lieutenant Kurotsuki. How did you do that, without the power of Shikai?" "Oh, that's easy. I fought Nimue with Shun Shunrika's help." Orium pointed to her hairpins, then called forth her fairies. Shino waved happily, Hinajiku bowed while Lily spun on herself and made a curtsy, Bagon flexed his muscles, Tsubaki crossed his arms and harumphed, and Ayam hid a bit more under her large coat. Orium chuckled at the fairies' antics, then motioned for them to do a quick demonstration of her shields and pyramid, before turning to a very surprised Nanao. "See? They might look cute, but they're great fighters too." Nanao nodded, before asking, "They're the spirits of your hairpins, right?" "That's sort of like a Zanpakuto spirit, but the way you called them out is very different." Orium had no idea what Nanao meant, and the other girl clearly saw it in her eyes, as she said, "I'll show you what I mean," while getting up and raising her Zanpakuto in front of her. Then she called out, her voice clear but calm, "Shikai, reflect, Shinken Hakioken." There was a sudden surge of Ryatsu from the blade, and then it transformed. The blade was large and flat, lacking edges on either side and with a square tip. The material was some glowing metal that looked a lot like gold, with 4 very large, diamond-shaped mirrors along itself, and rather than a normal tsuba was a richly decorated bandguard with blue tassels dangling from it. Orium couldn't help but look on in awe at the sword and comment, echoed by Shino, Lily, and Bagon. "That's such a cool and beautiful sword, Nanao." Orium's words caught the other girl by surprise, and she reddened in embarrassment for a moment, before bringing a fist to her mouth and coughing slightly as she closed her eyes, which helped her be more composed when she opened them and said, "Thank you, but did you notice the difference between that and what you did to call out the fairies?" Orium shook her head, because she honestly had no idea what the other girl was talking about, so Nanao explained, in a patient tone. "When you summoned your fairies, you pushed your Ryatsu into your hairpins." That clarified matters for Orium, and she quickly raised her hand to ask for permission to speak. Nanao stopped, looking somewhat confused, which Orium guesses was because she didn't expect her to figure it on her own. Orium didn't let that ruffle her. It was a mistake a lot of people made, especially teachers, and she was pretty sure that people who knew a lot of things simply forgot that teaching meant helping people figure things out on their own, rather than just telling them. "You didn't push anything into the sword, it gave you the power instead. Right?" She grinned happily and pumped her fist into the hair when Nanao nodded. The other girl coughed again, which drew Orium's attention back to her, just in time to notice she'd returned her blade to its normal state. It was a pity, because the Shikai was very beautiful, but Orium could see the logic, since it wasn't like Nanao was going to need the power to fight anything right now. "Right. I pointed it out because it indicates the possibility that you are taking the wrong approach to connecting with the Zanpakuto." Orium grasped immediately what Nanao meant, gasping in realization. "You think I'm trying to force the connection, but I should be trying to get the sword to connect with me on its own." Then Orium scratched her chin as she started to think it over. "That's what I wanted to do in the first place though, but how do I do that? Though pushing my Ryatsu into the sword would start things off, but if it's pushing it off." The idea made Orium suddenly panic, and she turned to Nanao with wide eyes to ask, "Do you think I might have scared it off?" Nanao was taken aback for a moment, but then shook her head and said, in an authoritative tone, "I'm sure nothing you did was irreparable." Orium let out a breath of relief, then she was surprised when Nanao sat next to her and placed a hand on her shoulder as she asked, curious, "Why are you so determined in unlocking this sword's Shikai? You already have a power that is just as powerful, focusing on training that would be a much more efficient way to grow stronger." Orium frowned, puzzled at the question, and explained, "I'm not, I just wanted to be a friend to this blade, because it seems so sad to leave it all alone when it was created to have a companion, you know? It was just the right thing to do. Naneo, once again, seemed genuinely surprised. Orium decided that the other girl was probably so used to things working like they did in this place where laws were more important than people, that she just never expected it when somebody was kind. In a sense, it was sad, but Orium chased that thought away. Naneo was obviously very smarty and didn't need any pity. She needed Orium's help as a friend, to show her that caring for others was normal. Orium nodded to herself upon reaching her resolution, but before she could speak on it, Naneo got up, patting her on the shoulder as she said, her expression thoughtful. "Just wait here for a moment, I think I have an idea how to help." Then she left, and true to her words, returned just a couple of minutes later, dragging Mr. Shunsui along by the sleeve. Orium paused the study of the Zanpakuto's edge she had been doing while she waited, and turned toward the middle-aged-looking captain as he and Naneo both sat down. "So, Miss Inu, according to what Naneo told me, I'm guessing you're a Fullbringer, correct?" Orium couldn't help but lower her head a bit in embarrassment as she said. "Ah, I'm sort of one, but I'm not really that good at using the tricks, nothing like Ryrika or Chad, and they don't really work much here." Shino, Lily, Began, and Hinajika all shouted at once and loudly, "That's not true. Orium is amazing," which made her feel even more self-conscious since she knew she wasn't as good at them. She willed the 6 Shunshunrika to return inside the hairpins, dismissing them, before slapping her cheeks to recover her focus and nod decisively toward Mr. Shunsui. "I am a Fullbringer, and I'll get better at it." Mr. Shunsui hummed, then motioned to one of the pillows on the floor and asked, "Could you show me?" Orium happily nodded, then grabbed the nearest pillow, a pretty yellow one with white frills, and started to push Ryotsu into it, trying to tell it to become rigid. It took her almost a full minute, but eventually she smiled, saying "Here," as she offered the pillow to Mr. Shunsui, who experimentally pushed at it with a finger and then smiled lazily when he found his finger didn't sink into it. "Very interesting. And yet, despite having a power of your own already, Naneo told me you want to connect with your Zanpakuto, and not to become stronger, but simply to become its friend, because you think the sword needs one." "Of course it does. I don't know how long ago it was that its last owner died," Mr. Urahara didn't say, "but that's already a lot of time. If I can do anything to cut its loneliness shorter, then it's my duty to do so." Mr. Shunsui leaned backwards, his fingers tapping the pommel of the 2 Zanpakuto at his side in an absent-minded manner, looking thoughtful for a moment before saying, "What if the sword wanted to be left alone? Have you considered that?" Orium had, of course. You couldn't become the friend of somebody that didn't want to be your friend, that wasn't how these things worked. But that didn't mean that one shouldn't try, and it certainly didn't mean leaving somebody alone who might want a friend without trying to reach them first. She clenched her fists in determination and answered, forcing the determination on her face. "That's not a reason not to try. If the sword tells me it doesn't want my company, of course I won't force myself on it. But how can I know if it doesn't tell me? And how could it tell me, if I don't reach it to ask first?" Mr. Shunsui's eyebrows shot up at that, and he said, sounding intrigued, "Well, you have some strong convictions, Miss Inu, I don't think anybody can deny that. And with a determination like that, I almost feel obligated to try and help you." You can help, Mr. Shunsui." Orium was grateful that he wanted to help, but she wasn't sure how the man could possibly do it. Still, he nodded with such confidence that Orium couldn't help but feel her own confidence be buoyed by it in turn, so she settled to listen as the man leaned forward. "You see, Miss Inu, I am the only Shinigami in the entire story of the Godei 13 to have ever bonded with more than one Zanpakuto." He motioned to the 2 blades at his belt, "which makes me something of an expert in solving the same type of problem you've been having." Orium's eyes widened at that. She did remember what Mr. Urahara had said about Zanpakuto only bonding with one person at a time. The question came unbidden to her lips, and she didn't hesitate to ask, in wonderment. "How were you able to do that?" The man shrugged, as if to indicate it was no big deal. "I'm not sure explaining it would help you. Most people aren't able to understand, and others can't truly get into the right mindset. It's a long explanation, and it would lead us far astray from my point. On the other hand, should you actually be able to understand it, that might come in handy, and make my help that much more effective." He trailed off, considering, then asked, sounding very serious. "Tell me, Miss Inu, would be able to tell me what the difference is between true friendship and real love? We have two words for it, yet for one who truly mean them, drawing the line between them isn't easy. Could you draw that line? Tell me precisely, with no doubt and full conviction, what the difference between love and friendship is." Orium went red with embarrassment. She considered answering anyway, because she was curious what he would see. However, after a moment of thought, she began to doubt. Surely that couldn't be the only difference. It would be shallow, wouldn't it? It felt like it would be. But then, if that first instinctive answer was wrong, then, what? Was there even a right answer to give? She wasn't sure, and when she hesitantly admitted it, Mr. Shunsui smiled in an understanding manner. "That's nothing to be ashamed of, it's a complicated question. If you ever do have an answer for me, let me know, and I'll gladly try to explain to you how that led me to my own revelation." Then he kindly patted her on the head. Orium puffed her cheeks in annoyance at that, fixing her hairs, while the man chuckled and went on with his other explanation. "You see, as a full-bringer, it is natural for you to push your emotions out into the world, use them to affect and change it. That's one of the most distinguishing traits of full-bringers in general. If I'm fully honest, the fact that you're a very emotional person is not all that surprising, Miss Inu. You're the sort of person that leaves a mark when she speaks to people." Orium grinned upon being called emotional. Tatsuki and Sora both used to call her that as well, very often, and she'd always thought it was a great compliment. After all, every story ever said that being good meant helping people, so knowing she had a calling for it, at least according to other people, always made her quite proud of being herself. It was validating. "I do my best to be. Going out and putting in the effort is the only way the world gets better. We can't be good people if we don't do our part in making things change, isn't it?" Mr. Shunsui looked bemused at that. "I expected you would think so, Miss Inu. However, some people prefer to wait before they act, so that they don't get tired and can give their full effort at the appropriate moment. It's still an attempt to change things, but focused in an effort to get the most out of limited resources." Orium considered the matter thoughtfully. She could understand the reasoning behind it, but even so. "That seems like a bad idea to me. What if the right moment never comes? Then all the small changes that could have been achieved by working to change things day by day never happen, but the big change all at once doesn't, and everything stays the same." She shook her head. "I don't like that type of plan." Mr. Shunsui chuckled at that. "I'm not surprised you would say so. However, I really think that's the way your Zanpakuto thinks. In fact, I believe that's a very common way for Zanpakuto to see the world, since swordsmanship is all about waiting for the right opening to deliver the winning strike." Oh. That made a sort of sense to Orium. However, after a moment of thinking it over, she frowned and asked, "But how does that helps me make friends with the sword?" "It's actually quite simple, really. You just need to use the sword, as much as you can, showing it respect and care, making it see that by helping you, it could just find a way to make a difference. If you do it long enough, make it pleasant enough, without pushing, then it might come a moment when the sword sees something that makes it open itself to you." He grinned. "I expect that keeping the effort up for a long time won't be a problem for you, Miss Inu." "Of course not. If she just needed to be more friendly with the sword more often, that wasn't hard at all." She grinned, and was ready to bow in thanks to Mr. Shunsui, but the man raised a hand to stop her from doing so, and went on. "There is another thing. If you want the sword to see the worth of opening up to you, you need to show it your own worth first. Naneo said you can't push your Ryotsu into the sword, but you are a smart girl, so I'm sure you will be able to figure out other ways you can use your full bringer power to make it easier for it to be a sword. For example, if you can make a pillow harder, maybe you could make the armor of an enemy softer, or something else of the sort. You just need to be creative. Can you do that?" "I will." Orium nodded, her fist trembling with determination. She would absolutely find every possible way she could to help her sword, to show it that Orium really cared about it. Mr. Shunsui could clearly see the determination shining in her eyes, and he smiled, looking pleased. "That's the spirit. Of course, to really give your best, you will need to learn how to use a sword as well. We don't really have the time for formal training, but I think Nanao here could handle a quick crash course in these next 2 days to start you off. Orium's eyes widened at that, and she exclaimed really. As she turned toward Nanao who, with a smile of her own, bowed respectfully toward her. It would be my pleasure to help you train in the way of the sword, Orium. Orium didn't hesitate to launch herself forward and hug her new friend, which caused the bespectacled girl to stumble in surprise, but Orium was far too happy to care. Thank you, Nanao, you're great. She let go after a moment, and while the other girl, who despite the shock was smiling, focused on settling the wrinkles out of her Shinigami uniform, Orium made a fist pump of satisfaction. Having a clear path forward in befriending her Zanpakuto was a lot more progress than she'd expected to make, and it was just the beginning. Orium was ready to do her best, and she was no quitter. She'd show the sword she was a friend worth having. Chapter 59, Misleading. As Tatsuki came back to her senses, it took her a moment to identify her surroundings. The sense of warmth surrounding her had to be blankets, and there was a dull pain to her abdomen, faint but present. She tried to remember how she had gotten hurt, and why she had not simply used her hollow to recover from the wound. That caused a sudden flow of memories, bringing the battle with the unstoppable captain, Kenpei, to the forefront of her mind, and she jerked to a sitting position in a sudden movement that caused a spike of pain from her wound. Tatsuki grimaced, placing a hand on it to find it had been bandaged, and took 2 long breaths to get herself under control. At least she didn't feel any wetness under her fingers, meaning she wasn't bleeding out. Well, it seems like she woke up. Finally. Tatsuki blinked as she recognized the second voice, and managed to calm herself enough to actually have the time to watch around herself, and focus on the voice's owner. Kenpei was sitting on a bench, his torso and left arm almost entirely wrapped in bandages. He was grinning in an anticipatory manner, and even if she wasn't being shocked by his overwhelming Ryutsu like she'd been during their fight, just that intense, almost unhinged look was enough to make her shiver with worry. The fact that Yachiro, the pink-haired girl Tatsuki had fought against and completely failed to hit in any way, was sitting over Kenpei's right shoulder made the scene weirder, but Tatsuki wasn't sure if it made the captain less scary, or more so. On one hand, it was quite domestic, on the other, that was 2 incredibly deadly fighters she wasn't sure she could beat staring her down at once. And the fact the kid's smile was more friendly wasn't really all that comforting, considering how she considered fights to the death to be some form of amusing game. Still, it relaxed her a moment when Yachiro turned to the left and said, in a joyous tone. See, Baldy, you didn't need to worry so much, your healing worked alright, Masuki is totally fine. Tatsuki turned to see who the little girl was addressing, and what she found was 2 men sitting at a table, one of the 2 bald and with a sharp chin, and the other one with chin-length black hairs framing a somewhat effeminate face, emphasized by yellow and red feathers attached to the eyebrow and already long eyelashes on the left side of his face. The latter was looking at Tatsuki and nodded vaguely at her when he noticed her attention, while the bald one looked very annoyed as he said back to the pink-haired kid. I might know some first aid, but it's not going to be the same as what the healers can do. She might collapse any moment, and I'm not going to take responsibility for it if she does. Kenpei laughed, a dark and threatening sound that immediately redirected Tatsuki's attention to him, and said in amusement. Don't worry, she can just use her regeneration to get better. The bells attached to his spiked hairdo ringed lightly as he leaned forward toward Tatsuki, his smile reminding her of nothing less than a hungry shark as he added, Isn't that right? Tatsuki knew better than to answer that kind of question. She hadn't forgotten the man had stabbed her to force her hollow side out. She wasn't about to use it now, or let him know she didn't want to, when either could just lead to more fighting out of some deranged effort to make her recover. She didn't, however, know what the best thing to do in response would be. Luckily, she was saved from having to figure it out by the voice of what had to be the pretty boy, as he seemed to scold his bald colleague in the tired tone that suggested they'd had this discussion multiple times already. Ikeku, you know we couldn't bring her to the 4th without getting her arrested. The man merely grumbled whatever at that, and Tatsuki seized the opportunity to ask. Why would you not want me to be arrested? Because if you are, then I won't get my fight. She turned back toward Kenpei, her pulse quickening and muscles tensing to react to anything he might try to do, but when he didn't look like he was about to start attacking, Tatsuki found herself confused enough to ask, "Which fight are you talking about?" "My fight with Jin, of course. You said I could use your documents to get that, but Yumi Chika said it isn't enough." Tatsuki was well aware that she had never said any such thing. In fact, she had no idea that the madman had a grudge with Jin big enough to want to fight with him, not any clear idea why he would need the evidence she was carrying to justify acting on it. He just didn't seem like the type to care about due process. Trying to make sense of this, she turned her confused glare toward the feather-eyed guy, apparently named Yumi Chika, and the pretty boy let out a long breath, raising his hand to show the folder of evidence Kyokaku had given her, as he explained. "This is a very interesting collection of information, for sure, but it doesn't really do much to change the current situation at all, other than confirm that Captain Shihoan was framed and thus her exile was unjustified. It might cast aspersion on Captain Ichimaru's character, and maybe lead to an investigation from the Omnitsukido, but until the 2nd Division finds something more with such an investigation, attacking him would still be unjustified." He paused, then turned to give a wary side-eye to Kenpeki as he added, "Although, of course, I might be missing something, since trawling through paperwork isn't really my specialty. We really should have spent more time looking for Tsukishima to have him check this out." The captain scoffed, his bells ringing lightly, while giving an annoyed glance at his subordinate. "He wasn't at his home, and you said yourself the last news before we went dark was that he was the primary suspect in bailing out 2 of the invaders from their fight with Mayuri. If he's hiding, looking for him would be a complete waste of time." Yachiro, still sitting on Kenpeka's shoulder, nodded along and added, raising a finger in the manner of a lecturer, "Plus, if somebody saw us walking around, they might ask about Ken's last fight, and then we might have to give Maski to them, and Ken wouldn't be able to fight Jinny then." "Why not?" Everybody's eyes turned on Tatsuki at her question, but she kept up a defiant expression. She was tired with not understanding what was going on, and as much as she didn't think she could win if it came to a fight against these 4 at once, she wasn't going to let herself be scared because of that. Something of this must have shown, because Kenpeka grin returned in full force. "Ready to fight, aren't you? I like that. It's not my willingness to fight we're talking about." Kenpeka laughed at that, even as Yachiro pouted and said, Ken has plenty of will to fight," in a very annoyed tone. The big captain, however, merely patted the kid on her head, somehow managing not to ruffle her pink hairs at all in the process, and then focused on Tatsuki as he answered, "I'm always willing to fight, anybody, at any time, anywhere. But if I get in a fight with Jin and kill him, then the old geezer will not simply show up alone to give me a good fight, he'll bring everybody down on my head at once, even Retsu." The man took a pause there, a look on his face that seemed somewhat wistful, while also carrying the closest thing to fear Tatsuki had ever seen in his eyes. It didn't last long at all, but even the possibility that such a thing could manifest in Kenpeka's eyes was enough to leave her speechless. He didn't take long to recover from it, however, and soon he was continuing his explanation in a very determined tone. "If they do that, then I'd not have the chance to make a proper fight of it, they'd kill me before I have any chance to enjoy it, and I'm not going to throw away the chance for something as awesome as a duel with either of them in such a manner. If I ever get into a duel with either of them, I want to enjoy it to the fullest, since I'm likely never again going to get the chance for anything better than that. It's not something I'd willingly waste just to get Jin to finally fight me at full power." He then pointed his index finger at her and said, a light note of threat entering his voice, "So, when the old geezer shows up, I need something to give him that proves killing Jin was just me doing my duty. And you need to tell me how I am going to make that happen." Yumi Chika, who seemed the most interested in the discussion, Yachiro was simply smiling and nodding along, while the bald guy, Ikeku, seemed to just be bored with the whole proceedings, leaned forward as he added, "I'd be curious to hear that as well. The captain mentioned you saying that this would prove Kukaki's innocence, but I can't see how." Focusing on the pretty boy rather than the monstrous captain was easier for Tatsuki, so she glared at him, channeling her annoyance at the whole situation, as well as her lack of anything to offer that could make these men happy, into her voice. "So what if you can't? It's not like you lot care about Rukia anyway, only about your fight, not that surprising meatheads like you lot couldn't figure it out." Yomishika's eyes narrowed in annoyance at that, clearly not happy at all with being called an idiot, as he shot back, "Maybe since we're so stupid, We should just give you to the third and see what Captain Ichimaru makes of you and all your evidence then? Is he smart enough to figure this all out? Tatsuki didn't outwardly react to that. She had to hope the Shinigami was bluffing, because if he really handed her and all the evidence off to Jin, that would be an absolute disaster. Although, in a sense, it was comforting to know what the worst possible scenario was, in that it gave her something to work against. While she tried to figure a way out of this, Ikeka groaned and glared at Yumichika, sounding incredibly annoyed. Man, you're joking, right? After I've spent the best part of the last 2 days ensuring she didn't die, you're gonna give her out? Why make me waste all of that time then? Yumichika seemed ready to answer, but before he could, Kenpeki spoke. None of that. He tapped the fingers of his left hand on his knee, with a sound that seemed much more like a gong, metal striking metal, than anything flesh and bones should do, and when everybody turned to watch the captain, he said, in a tone that broke no argument. I'm gonna get my fight to the death, one way or another, either it's with Jin, or Tatsuki here will get the chance to show off to you all what she's capable of. That said, the captain turned an extremely intense gaze toward her, and Tatsuki got a sudden, immediate appreciation for what the worst possible scenario actually looked like, along with a renewed dedication to never again tempt fate like that. Even with just one eye visible, which was weird, she was pretty sure the man hadn't had an eye patch when they'd fought last, and she hadn't hurt his eye any in that fight that she could remember. Kenpeki's gaze was unsettling enough she could start to feel her breath hitching slightly, and she was pretty sure he wasn't even attempting to focus his Ryutsu. So, you have an answer, or not? She had to think of something, and considering what the man wanted and what she was actually in this situation for, there was only one answer she could go for. She drew on the annoyance she could vaguely sense coming from her inner hollow at having been sealed away, using it to cover any emotional tell she had that might make it seem like she was lying, and said, "Of course I do." Then, not wanting to have to hold Kenpeki's inquisitive gaze focused on her, she turned toward Yumichika instead and stated with as much determination as she could. The evidence in itself isn't enough, but it proves that Jin framed the Vizard to escape, it just doesn't explain why. Every one of the surrounding Shinigami leaned forward in interest at that, with Yachiro clapping her hands in excitement and asking with eagerness. So what is it, Maski? You know, don't you? Naturally. It's because he was looking for a weapon, and the Vizard stole it. If he had it, he could obliterate Soul Society. That caused glances that Tatsuki wasn't sure how to interpret. Some looked worried, while others, Kenpeki especially, quite excited, with the huge captain immediately asking, "What sort of weapon is that?" an eager glint in his eye. She could feel the note of greed in his voice, and cold shivers ran down her spine at the idea he might suddenly decide to join Jin so he could wield the weapon, or, considering Kenpeki's personality, an even worse possibility presented itself. What if he decided to let Jin get his hands on the Hujioku so the man would make a more powerful, and thus fun, opponent to fight? Luckily, there was a way to frame the truth that could work with what Tatsuki needed the madman to do, so she didn't need to lie at all. Rather, she let her confidence in her own honesty fill her soul, using just the barest, most subtle hints of Hakuta to coax the emotion forward without revealing what she was doing, and then straightened to better show that she knew what she was talking about. It's called the Hujioku, and it allows the wielder to control hollows like puppets. If Jin has it, he could lead an entire army here in Soul Society, but more importantly, if nobody is aware that he has it, he could simply secretly put an hollow inside anybody he wanted to remove, and then he'd be able to control them absolutely. No fight, no chance to resist at all, merely being enslaved to his will for all of eternity. She could see she had hit her mark as a spark of what looked like genuine rage appeared in Kenpeki's eyes, and as scary as the man was, Tatsuki could only feel triumph at seeing it there, because it wasn't aimed at her. The man growled out, "Are you sure?" in the tone of somebody who wanted to hear a no, but she merely tapped herself on her chest and answered, letting her honesty give strength to her answer. "That's how I was made into a Vizard, the power of that thing was used on me directly. Trust me, with the Hujioku in hand, there isn't any way to resist, no way to counter the control it imposes." Kenpeki's right hand closed into a fist at that, the sound once again more akin to metal on metal, although this time it sounded very nearly like a trash compactor being activated. "We're not going to let that happen." Yachiro nodded with a determination that was unsuited to her face, while Ikeka merely shrugged. Yumichika, however, looked perplexed as he said. That still doesn't explain how this all ties with your goal of saving Rukia Kukaki. Tatsuki focused on drawing upon the overpowering emotions of her sealed inner hollow to cover her own once more, this time looking for arrogant self-confidence to hide any dishonesty or doubts she was feeling over whether her plot might work. She had to sell this to them if she wanted to save Rukia, and if she did it right, she might just get them to help. Because Rukia, with the help of Yoriyuki, myself, and my friends, managed to recover the Hujioka from the Vizard before Jin could get it himself, she's the only one who know where it is hidden, and she can use it to prove that it was Jin who'd stolen it. Ikeko spoke up then, sounding doubtful. Then why wouldn't she have said so back when she was judged? She wouldn't have needed all this stuff you have here to prove herself innocent. Tatsuki smiled, if grimly, for this one answer, she wouldn't need to lie at all. She didn't have it on her when she was arrested, and was worried about Jin's spies in your government getting to it before your authorities if she revealed the location. That's what having Aizen speak on her behalf was supposed to help with, but Jin removed him, took the option off the table. Makes sense. Ikeko nodded, apparently persuaded, and while Tatsuki made sure to keep herself impassible on the outside, inside she was happy, she might have just managed to persuade them. Something which was confirmed as Yumichika let out a huff and nodded in a tired tone. Yeah, that checks out. From what I've heard before we went dark, Jin volunteered to guard Kukaki as they led her to the execution site on Sokioku Hill. He's likely going to be there to try and get her to hand over the location of this Hujioku in exchange for him saving her life. Tatsuki knew that Rukia would never betray them, not even to save her own life, but she didn't state it out loud. That's not what she needed these people to think about. Instead, she turned to glare at Kenpei, mustering all of her brazenness to do it. It wasn't easy, but she'd already faced this monster for her friends once, she could do it again if it got her the help she needed. Which is why we need to hurry up and save her. Remember, if Rukia dies, then all your chances of getting your big fight will be gone with her. The big captain didn't look intimidated at all by her display of confidence. Instead, his grin grew larger, and she could feel the sense of dread and the lust for blood clearly manifest in his ryotsu as he said. And since Jin will be there to guard her, I won't even need to waste time looking for him. You guys just need to make sure Kukaki's sister doesn't die while I have my duel. It's perfect. We'll need to punch through a lot of the Shinigami who will be there to witness the execution, won't we? Yumichika let out a long breath as he said so, but Ikeko sported a grin that made him look remarkably similar to his captain, as he elbowed the pretty boy in a friendly manner. Come on now, why so down? That's gonna be one awesome fight. Yachiro nodded happily in agreement at that, her smile as cute as any kid, and completely in contrast with her words as she exclaimed, it'll be the best brawl ever. Apparently, that was enough to make Yumichika smile, which made even less sense to Tatsuki when the pretty boy Shinigami said, sounding almost amused. Oh, I do look forward to it, don't get me wrong. It's just that, by law, all the captains need to attend the execution of a member of the 46 noble families, and if a few of them close in on us before we make it to the execution stand, we won't be able to save Kukaki, or really get any fun at all out of it. The latter was clearly the most pressing of the two concerns to Yumichika, and if the way Ikeko and Yachiro nodded along with it was any indication, for them as well. Tatsuki took a moment to appreciate the fact that, if anything, Hiyori had undersold the dedication of the 11th Division to brutal combat, and then focused, since this was too good a setup for her to let it slip by. Why don't you help me look for my friends then? If they come along, we'll be more likely to save Rukia, and whoever's standing guard will have more targets to distract them. After all, if my friends were able to hurt you, then you can't deny they'd be a great help, could you? She gestured at Kenpeika's bandages as she said that, and the man grinned as he said, oh yeah, the Kurosaka kid especially was good. I guess this being half-hollow thing you have going on really made you a ton stronger, didn't it? Ikeko, to Tatsuki's surprise, nodded along and added in a respectful tone. That would be a good idea, Kurosaki is pretty good, no doubt about that. Yumichika limited himself to shrugging. I mean, that's true, but it's not like we have the time to go looking for him, wherever he's hiding. Tatsuki immediately turned on him, her temper flaring enough for her to shout what? Why not? Because the execution is going to take place in 4 hours at most, it's scheduled for 3 hours after dawn, and we've less than 1 hour of night left right now. Even as the comments about having been unconscious for 2 days came crashing down on her like a sack of bricks, Tatsuki tried to keep her focus. So, they would not have a chance to go looking for her friends to coordinate an attack, but on the other hand, they probably would be looking to launch an attack to save Rukia anyway on their own, seeing as, if she was about to be executed, they clearly hadn't managed to free her yet. And so long as they were still alive and free, Tatsuki knew that, just like her, they weren't going to simply give up without trying until the end. Having gathered her wits, she immediately looked at the group of Shinigami in front of her and asked, in a deadly serious tone, "Are they all still at large? Was any of them captured, or?" She couldn't finish the sentence, but the Shinigami understood anyway, with Ikeka crossing his arms as he answered, "Nobody was killed that I know of, but a few of them were arrested. I think Renji was one of them, and also that guy you fought with, right, Yumi Chika? Yasutara Sato." "Yes, that's what I heard." Tatsuki seized that immediately. "If you fought Chad, you know how strong he is, surely we could be able to get him and whomever else out in the few hours we have, before we rush to stop the execution." But Yumi Chika shook his head at that. "No, after the last breakout they engineered, they're holding them under heavy surveillance, nothing we can't defeat, of course, even without the captain, but there's no way we'd be able to take out that many people without making enough chaos to bring them all down on us, which would rather defeat the purpose." Tatsuki could feel her anger rising at that. She couldn't accept that something as simple as the necessity of avoiding attention would keep her from being able to help her imprisoned friends. She was sure that there had to be a solution, and, as she considered the problem, she realized she had one, a sense of elation coming up to her as she asked, excitement in her voice. "What if we could get in without being detected? Would that make freeing Sato and the others possible?" Ikeka was the quickest to react, looking and sounding quite incredulous as he asked, "How would you do something like that?" In answer, Tatsuki pulled out the glass orb Kyukaku had given her, and explained. "This is a Raishokaku, you fill it with your Ryatsu, and so long as you don't get spotted, you cannot be detected by spiritual senses." She demonstrated, taking a long breath, then exhaling as she pushed her Ryatsu into it. As she opened her eyes, Yachiro was looking at her in amazement, while Ikeku and Yumi Chika looked dumbstruck. The latter quickly transitioned to a thoughtful expression as he commented. "It feels like there's nothing but empty air there, almost like you were a mirage. It'd be very effective, but I can still hear you breath, so even with this, being heard or spotted could be a risk." "That won't be a problem." Everybody turned toward Kenpeki as he spoke, and Tatsuki saw the man sported one of his most threatening grins yet. Yachiro's eyes widened at that, and she clapped her hands in joy. "Of course. Ken can sneak in and take down everybody so fast they won't have time to react." Tatsuki's disbelief was evidently pretty easy to see on her face, because Kenpeki said, seemingly amused, "Think I can't do it? Let me tell you a story then." Even as he spoke, he slowly began to untie the bells from his spiked hairs. After a moment, Yachiro, from her position sitting on his shoulder, went to help, while he continued to speak in the same amused tone. "In case you're unaware, when people in the mortal realm die, the soul tend to stay there long enough for the Shinigami to find it and send it to Soul Society. However, sometimes, a soul, especially a powerful one who has nothing keeping them tied to the mortal realm, will transcend without help, and move to the spiritual realm on its own. It has become rarer as the Godii grew in numbers and became more efficient, but when I died, 2000 years ago, they weren't that well organized. I was one of those souls who slipped through the cracks." Kenpeki had lowered his head to give Yachiro better access, and Tatsuki realized that the bells, half of which they had by now removed, looked to be made of very thin metal, as if having been intentionally chosen to produce as much sound as possible. Despite this, she knew that they barely ringed when Kenpeki made a very sudden movement. Even during their battle, she'd only heard them a handful of times, and never with as loud a sound as the sheer quantity he was collecting should have made. He didn't pay attention to her expression, however, continuing his tale without changes in inflections. "So, as it always happened to souls that transcend in that manner, instead of reappearing in Soul Society, I found myself in a random spot in Hueco Mundo. I started walking, and it wasn't long before hollows started hunting me, but I learned how to avoid them, then how to kill them, and eventually, I became the hunter. I kept moving in the same direction, and eventually made it to the outer edges of the Rokanga, where I met Yachiro. Things got easier at that point. But I never forgot all that I learned, and I even put it to use as a thief for a while, before I decided that joining the Shinigami and going back to hunt hollows would be more fun. With all the bells removed from his hairs, he straightened his head and stretched his neck a bit, then he turned his hand to let the bells fall down onto a table, the cacophony of them bouncing onto each other and on the table itself almost deafening in its loudness, as Kenpei concluded. I wear bells so that my enemies have an easier time keeping track of me. I'm so used to moving silently that without such an handicap, most people wouldn't even notice I'm moving, and that'd make a lot of fights even more boring than they already are. Now, hand that over. Tatsuki complied, placing the glass sphere in Kenpeika's hand as she explained. You can't use your Ryotsu in any way if you want this to work correctly. He chuckled darkly, and shot back with a threatening grin. I won't need to, my strength will be more than enough. Considering the feats she'd seen him pull out, Tatsuki had little doubt about that. She still had some doubt about his sneaking capabilities, but those vanished when, after a moment to fill the Raishukaka with his Ryotsu, Kenpeika got up from his position, so fast that Tatsuki wasn't sure he hadn't always been standing despite knowing it wasn't true, and so silent she'd heard nothing at all, nor did she as he snatched his sword and secured it to his belt without even the slight clinking of the sheath or swishing sound of the weapon moving through the air. And that was without considering that his presence, which even when he was as calm as he'd been throughout this meeting was impossible to miss, had simply vanished, the device hiding it completely just as it had for Tatsuki when she'd used it herself. While Yachiro was nodding along with amusement, Ikeku and Yumichiko looked in awe, and Tatsuki had to admit to feeling a bit of it herself, even as she considered that, much as she'd not have believed it possible, and as ridiculous of a concept as it was, she had obviously underestimated Kenpeika. The idea of such a monster being also a master of stealth was all kind of terrifying. The man, on the other hand, looked nothing if not satisfied that the device was working properly, and looking upon the group, he motioned for them to follow as he headed for the door of the small room they'd been cooped into. Let's go, we have a group of bumbling distractions to collect if I want to have my duel. And with no further word, or sound at all, where Kenpeika was involved, they were off. Rukia was starting to feel the length of her imprisonment weigh on her mind. Since her brother had come to talk to her, nobody else had shown up, other than the guards bringing in her meals, who had refused to speak to her in any manner. She wasn't sure if this was just First Division snobbery, or some form of punishment from Ichibe, who apparently was in charge of her imprisonment, for whatever he thought she was guilty of, but in either case, being left alone with her thoughts and nobody to speak to was starting to make her doubt herself. And if the silent treatment hadn't been enough, she was somewhat starting to lose track of time, with no outside windows and no timepieces of any sort. She couldn't be sure about how long she'd been kept there, especially as sleep had only come to her in irregular fits, and she was pretty sure the meals hadn't been delivered in a regular pattern either. The only thing that made it bearable was that she knew it would end soon, which she couldn't help but feel was pathetic. She didn't want to die, yet knowing her execution would not be long in coming was the only thing keeping her from completely losing her mind. Perhaps it was because of this that, when she heard a sound of approaching footsteps echoing down the long, empty corridor outside of her cell, Rukia hurried to the bars, to check on who was arriving, and why she felt enormously disappointed as she recognized the lazy gait, sharp features, and silver hairs of the man, and realized nothing good was going to come from this. Probably recognizing her dejected reaction from her eyes, Jin's smirk widened a bit as he waved in a friendly manner. Hello there, Rukia. I imagine you're not doing too well, but maybe some company can cheer you up. She did her best to muster all of her focus, then said to him, keeping her tone cold. Are you here to gloat about your victory? He stopped in front of her cell, then cocked his head to the side, his smile growing smaller as if to show confusion, even letting a few hints of it in his Ryotsu, although Rukia had no doubts he was just playing pretend. Victory? What do you mean? Stop this charade. You killed Captain Aizen, and I'm about to be executed. You have everything you wanted now. Jin's smile grew a bit larger and he straightened, as if in sudden understanding. Oh. You're blaming me, I see. Don't worry, I won't be offended, I know it's a popular pastime. Rukia scoffed at the act, motioning to their surroundings as she said, in a resentful tone. You realize there's no recording devices or arrays set up here, right? The Royal Guards wouldn't ever let any of our research team personnel desecrate their traditional holding areas, so you don't need to pretend that it was anybody but you to create this whole situation. She wasn't sure if that was fully true or not, while she knew the 1st would never lower themselves to ask the help of other divisions, much less the 12th, which was almost by nature the opposite of their "let's protect tradition" outlook. It was fully possible they had some arrangement to spy on prisoners of their own. Still, uncertainty over the possible gains was no reason not to tempt her enemy into making a mistake anyway, not to mention how much of a palliative on her nerves would be if they could just be straight with one another, instead of having to discuss anything circuitously. Jin, however, didn't seem inclined to make things any easier, as he merely chuckled and answered. I am not sure what you're talking about, but I wouldn't say I have everything I want. There is, however, something you have that I wouldn't mind having. He clasped his hands together in a mockery of prayer, and then asked, his smile almost disarming. The location of the Hujiaku. Could you give me that? Rukia didn't expect that, and was left speechless for a moment at such brazenness, but then, she realized, it wasn't like he'd admitted anything, and it would be impossible to prove he was doing anything more than asking about a lost item. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a long breath as she considered the only reason the Hujiaku was not in Jin's hands already was because she had found friends she could trust to keep it safe. Friends, she realized, who were surely even now trying to get her free. With a bit of effort, she called on that warm emotion, the sense of belonging in a group that trusted her, and put on her most smug of smiles as she opened her eyes again and spat back at him. You're never going to find it. Jin's smile shrunk at that, turning into an expression of confusion again. That's some serious spite and defiance again, I must admit. It is impressive to still have such an unbroken spirit with your death looming over you. Is there something giving you such resilience? He scratched his chin in a thoughtful pose, but then his face lit up with a new, big smile as he snapped his fingers in realization, pointing one at her. Oh, I know. You trust in your little brigade of friends to come save you, isn't it? Then he frowned, his smile dimming to a most embarrassed one as he scratched the back of his head. I guess you didn't hear. A sense of dread wrapped itself around Rukia at that, a whispered what? Out of her lips before she realized what she was saying. She then shook her head, trying to rally, but before she could say anything, Jin went on, his smile slowly growing more satisfied. Well, where should I start? I mean, you probably already know Swaifo arrested Miss Hinamori, and Toshiro captured that annoying Urahara Kisuke, and maybe even that the two Kuratsuka fought Urayu Ishida and Oriaminu. But I doubt you know that Deertuan arrested your friend Abarai, as well as Yasutara Sato, Izuru Kira, and Hanataro Yamada. As for the Lady Shihoan, your very own brother tracked her down and sprung a trap on her with 4 other captains and almost 3 full divisions as backup, and while nobody knows exactly what happened to Tatsuki Arisawa, the last area she was seen into is also the one where Kenpeka was last sighted. I'm sure you know how much that man loves his little hunts. Good old Zaraki is probably dragging it out for fun, although I imagine he's the only one of the two who's having any. Rukia wasn't sure when she'd taken a few steps backwards or moved a hand to cover her mouth at Jin's hurtful words, but she knew he had to be lying, somehow, yet the sheer amount of smugness in his smile couldn't possibly be faked, could it? He took a step forward, and she had to force herself from letting her instinct push her into moving backwards again, and Jin's smile took a menacing cast as he added. And of course, I defeated Ichigo Kurosaki myself, took his sword away and cut him apart in a way not even his hollow powers could make him recover from. You're alone, nothing will save you from your impending death, and there is nobody left to help you. She shook her head, trying to push the idea away. She couldn't believe it, she couldn't accept that all of her friends, everybody she trusted, had been either arrested or killed, all for nothing more than trying to help her. Except it made sense, didn't it? She had led them to this, and once again, the people who had put their trust in her, who had been willing to follow her, had all suffered for it. It was always like that, wasn't it? Perhaps it would be better if she died, after all, at least she would stop ruining people's lives by getting them to trust her, somehow thinking she was fit to lead them to anything other than their death. Rukia hadn't realized she'd fallen to her knees until she heard Jin's voice again, coming from above her, as he said, his tone sweet like the deadliest poison. "Nobody, that is, except for me." She looked up, and from below, there was nothing reassuring in the smile he was sporting. It was so cold and cruel it almost looked like he didn't have an actual face, but rather a theater mask slid over his features. She stared uncomprehendingly, and he elaborated, the terrifying grin on his lips all the while. "You know what my Bankai is capable of, how I can slash through walls without damaging them, while cutting to pieces every single person inside a building. Just one solitary swing is all it would take me to do something like that." One of his hands tapped absently over the pommel of his sword, while the other made a large wave to encompass the prison surrounding them, making it very clear which building he was speaking of, before he went on, in the same tone. "You have no other way to survive." That, more than anything else, was what let Rukia snap out of it, as she got back on her feet and shouted, her throat feeling raw from the sheer effort of it. "You think I care about surviving?" Jin's smirk shrunk a bit at that, going back to his slightly surprised expression from before. "Why shouldn't you?" He didn't give her the time to answer, instead spreading his arms in a disarming fashion as he continued. "After all, I thought you wanted to change Seoul society. Isn't that what your dear Captain Aizen always went on about? The very task of the 12th Division, to bring change and new things to Seoul society, to push it into becoming better? Surely that is good enough of a reason to wish for your life to continue." Rukia's fist clenched in fury at the man's gall in calling up her captain's dream, to mock her with it. "Like you would care anything about that." "Oh, you wound me, Rukia," he said with a mocking smirk, placing a hand over his heart, before he pointed his other at her. "After all, we're not so different, you and I. We both know what it's like to live and suffer in the Rukanga, but we also know what it's like to be part of Seoul society's elite, the way only a member of a noble family and a Godai captain can. We know about the rot, and about its source, and how things need to change, one way or another." She glowered at him, barely keeping her emotions in check as she said back, through gritted teeth. "We're nothing alike. Aren't we? You'll need to explain me why. Or are you saying that change isn't necessary? I don't believe for a moment that you truly want any change to happen at all." The air went still at that, and for the first time since he'd shown up, Jin's smile completely disappeared, and then, Rukia saw his eyes open slightly, something that had never happened to her before, despite how long she'd known the man. The hatred glinting in those washed-out green irises was enough to almost take her breath away. It felt for a moment as if she wouldn't have to wait for her execution, and death was about to take her away right there and then. She blinked, and Jin was back to a friendly, beaming smile, as if the look from before had been nothing more than Rukia's imagination, even as the sweat on her skin told her it had been very, very real. Still, he went on as if it had never happened, opening his hands in a friendly gesture, as if inviting a hug. "So sure of your beliefs. That's admirable, really. However, whether I want real change or not, the fact of the matter is that change doesn't happen on its own. Somebody needs to force it to happen, and without a careful guiding hand, a strong leader to direct that change, nothing can come from it but chaos." "You're wrong." Rukia ignored the mocking smile Jin sported at that, and the slightly lilt as he asked "Am I?" and instead gathered all of her willpower to answer. No matter how scary his anger might have been, she was not going to let him pretend to be something he wasn't. "Yes. The path to change things is the one Captain Aizen took, to bring new knowledge and new ideas to the people, to help them see that change can happen and provide the means for it to happen. To follow the path of somebody who claims only they know best is no different than what's already wrong with Seoul society right now. It's merely falling for promises of an easy solution that is really just a lie to let somebody new continue the same old cycle. Actual change requires time, will, thought and effort from everybody working together. Your guiding hand would choke all of that for its own gain." Jin didn't seem particularly fazed, folding his hands behind his back as he leaned forward and asked, his smile turning curious. "Is that true? Or are you only saying this because, in your mind, I would be this lying leader? Would you be begging to join, I wonder, if it was Aizen asking the question in my place?" Rukia had thought she couldn't be surprised anymore at Jin's sheer arrogance, but once again, she found out she was wrong. If not for the fact that the bars would stop her, much as they were keeping her from casting any keto, she would have punched him in his smug smile for having dared to imply that Captain Eisen was anything like him. Sadly, with that impossible, she had to content herself with crossing her arms and snarling back, "Never. Captain Eisen never would have done anything like you're saying, and if he had, I wouldn't have helped him with it, because the fact he'd never do anything like that is the very reason I respected him in the first place." Jin smirked, turned amused at that, even as he nodded and said, "I suppose that's as much of an answer as any." Then he turned toward the end of the corridor, and shouted, much louder than the tone they'd been keeping during the conversation, "I'm done here, Lieutenant. The prisoner is ready to be transported." The sudden change of direction in the conversation left Rukia completely dumbfounded, to which Jin only answered with an amused grin as he said, in a mocking tone, "Wait, did I forget? I'm here to help Lieutenant Sasuke bring you to the Sokioku for your execution." Rukia's heart missed a beat at that, as if she'd been punched right in the chest. In the heat of her discussion with Jin, she had, if not forgotten about her impending death, at least pushed the thought to the back of her mind. Having it so forcibly dragged back to the forefront of her thoughts wasn't pleasant, especially as she realized that Jin had been toying with her the entire time. Trying to focus on anything else than the impending reality of her execution, Rukia thought over the fact she was to be executed by means of the Sokioku, and whether she felt more surprised or annoyed at the idea. On one hand, it implied that, even after condemning her for treason, the Central 46 still saw her as a member of one of the 46 noble families. On the other, some would argue an eternity of never-ending torment was worse punishment than simply being killed. The Sokioku was the sacred barrier that protected the throne room of the very Suriadii palace Rukia was currently in. It was a crucially important facet of Soul Society, seeing as the impassable walls of Suriadii that had made the founding of Soul Society possible in the first place were powered by the throne within. To keep it from being damaged was paramount, and the fact that the Sokioku guaranteed that safety was one of the main reasons why the 46 families maintained their power, since it was their souls that powered the Sokioku. It was a well-publicized fact that, whenever a member of one of them was dying, or had to be executed, the Sokioku was to be used to carry out the task and absorb their soul. The 46 families used it as a proof of their mandate, and of their dedication to Soul Society, given that the Sokioku absorbed the souls of those it killed, rather than letting them dissolve back into their component Reishi. They said the souls inside the Sokioku underwent an eternal not quite existence of unending torment, and that they nobly accepted this suffering in order to keep every other inhabitant of the Suriadii safe. To Rukia, this seemed like a lot of grandstanding, since there was no proof of such an existence of eternal suffering being what weighted those absorbed by the Sokioku, other than the 46 families' word. However, after considering the matter, she decided that she was fine with that being her destiny, eternal suffering or not. The idea of joining millions of others in keeping Soul Society safe was something that gave her a small sense of inner peace. She would be useful, and rather than bringing everybody who trusted her to death, she'd be contributing to keeping others safe, so, she decided, she would be grateful the Central 46 had decided to let her go this way. After all, there was always a small risk when letting the Sokioku absorb a soul, since it stopped working for a brief period of time whenever it happened. Their willingness to take that small risk to let her contribute to the future defense of Soul Society was something she felt she could be grateful for. It wasn't much, to be sure, but it was still better than nothing. And if nothing else, she'd stop leading people to their death. With that resolution in mind, when Jin opened the door, grabbing her by the shoulder and leaning in enough to whisper, "I'll be right next to you the whole time, if you change your mind on accepting my help," she shrugged him away, before turning toward Lieutenant Sasuke, standing in front of the elegant-looking man with silver gray hair and a thin, black handlebar mustache with her head held high. "I'm ready to face my sentence, Lieutenant Sasuke." The man nodded at her, respect on his features, and stated somberly, "Your acceptance of your punishment does you honor, Miss Kukaki. Please follow me without attempting to escape, and you will be treated with the respect due to your station. Myself and Captain Ichimaru shall be escorting you to Sokioku Hill, where your execution will be carried out according to the proper procedures." She nodded, and Lieutenant Sasuke turned his back while gesturing for her to follow, with Jin placing a hand on her shoulder to encourage her forward. She slapped it away, keeping to the same walking speed as Sasuke in front of her so that Jin would have no further reason to bother her. However, without the need to look strong anymore. She let out a long, tired breath, hanging her head, much as she at least had the satisfaction of having put the Hujioku out of Jin's reach, since if he hadn't found it after defeating all of her friends, it meant they'd hidden it well enough he never would. She didn't have much else to be happy about. All her friends were dead or soon to die because of her, and she was tired of it all. Thus, Rukia proceeded in silence as she marched to her death with only sadness and defeat in her heart. Tatsuki watched the corridor full of collapsed guards in front of her, before returning her gaze to the towering figure of Kenpeki, still trying to reconcile his tall, muscle-bound figure and bloodthirsty look with the fact he'd managed to perfectly sneak inside and take out every single Shinigami within without raising the alarm. It was disconcerting. It wasn't the fact that he'd apparently managed to defeat every guards with just one hit for each, that was absolutely easy to imagine. The fact he'd done it by moving through the entire containment area undetected rather than bulldozing through walls, and managed it without killing even a single person, was what beggared belief. And yet, it wasn't like she could much argue with results. Kenpeki had done as he had promised he would, then signaled for them it was safe to enter, and now they were heading for the cells where her friends were standing. At least, Tatsuki consoled herself, she wasn't the only one surprised by the whole event. Yumichika and Ikeku both looked just as puzzled, which was comforting. Yachiro merrily skipping ahead was a bit less so, but if nothing else it relieved some of the tension of walking through corridor after corridor filled with unconscious guards, so Tatsuki wasn't of a mind to bother the kid for her attitude yet. Once they reached the cells, however, Tatsuki pushed the thoughts aside in favor of moving to the front of the group, grinning at the rare sight of a surprised Chad, alongside two Shinigami, one with red hairs collected in a high ponytail, and one with a flock of blonde hairs hiding one of his eyes, who Tatsuki had never seen before. She waved, her grin growing wider as the group of 11th Division people emerged from behind her, and said in a chipper tone. "So, people, how's it hanging in there? Anybody up for a bit of prison breaking?" Chad raised a hand in greeting, speaking in his usual deadpan manner. "Tatsuki, nice seeing you. I think a prison breaking would be ideal at this time." Then he nodded in the direction of the Shinigami accompanying her, and added, a note of curiosity to his tone. "You got help?" Kenpeki spoke before she could answer, in a tone that made it clear he didn't want to waste any time. "She's promised me quite the fight, and needs you lot to make it happen. So, out you get." Following his words with actions, he made an absent-minded backhanded slap at the prison bars, breaking and ripping them out with what looked like barely any effort at all. Then he raised his other hand, which was holding two Zanpakuto he had apparently found the time to retrieve in passing when he was skulking about the place taking out guards, and threw them at the Shinigami with a threatening grin. Both looked up at him with genuine terror for a moment, which left Tatsuki puzzled, since he'd just armed them. Luckily, his next words seemed to calm the two down. "Don't worry, it's not me I need you to fight, this time. You both did well enough to amuse me with these, I hope it wasn't a fluke." Then he paused, frowning, before asking, "Where is your medic, anyway?" "This is the only cell with anybody inside in the whole area, I checked." It was the blonde guy to answer, his voice and expression both looking somewhat chagrined. "Ah." Captain Anohana took Hanataro away herself, said she wanted to handle his punishment personally. Everybody other than Chad and herself winced at that, with Ikeku even muttering something akin to "poor bastard." Tatsuki had no idea who this Anohana woman was, but she got a sudden sense that getting onto her bad side wouldn't be wise. Still, she wasn't with them now, so Tatsuki ignored the feeling, instead clapping her hands together to get everybody attention as she said. "Right, so getting through all these guards took some time, which means we have barely more than an hour left to save Rukia before they kill her. Are you ready for this, gentlemen?" The three nodded, and the redhead, which, she noticed as he stepped forward, was surprisingly tall and in exceptionally good shape, also tapped his fist to his chest as he said, sounding eerily determined. "Of course, I'm not gonna let a friend in danger like that." Tatsuki nodded, in perfect agreement. "Let's go then, what was your name, again?" The redhead switched to a more relaxed grin as he said, "Renji Abarai, and my friend there is Izuru Kira." He offered a fist, which Tatsuki bumped with a grin of her own and a quick Tatsuki Arisawa. "Let's go save ourselves a damsel then." With everybody in agreement, they turned and started to leave, but just as they exited the building, they found a group of 5 people waiting for them, each one wearing Shinigami uniforms and 2 of them with a Haori very similar to Kenpeika's own. Among them was the tallest man Tatsuki had ever seen, larger than even Kenpeika or Chad, with a conical and striped helmet sporting only a thin slit to see through hiding his entire face. Behind him were a dark-haired man with a pencil-thin mustache and slanted sunglasses, a big and burly man with short gray hairs and the number 69 tattooed on his chest, and a leaner, younger dark-haired man with 3 vertical scars under his right eye and a blue line plus the number 69 tattooed on his left cheek. Overall, it was a weird bunch, but not even the tall one was capable of drawing attention away from the man in front of the group for long, for he exuded an intensity that every one of the others lacked. Dark-skinned and with brown hair tied in a ponytail, a few braided locks dangling in front of his large sunglasses, he was wearing a large orange scarf around his neck, boots, and fingerless gloves that made him look far better put together than the rest. And, of course, he was already drawing his sword as he said, in an accusatory tone. I knew that remaining in communication with the guards here, and rushing to check immediately the moment they failed to report, was the right thing to do. It's clear that we need to change the way criminals are held. If they keep escaping with such frequency, prisons that cannot hold somebody in for longer than 2 days are no way to ensure justice. But then, I imagine no cage can last long if those that should guard it help people out of it instead. He pointed the Zanpakuto at Kenpeika, in a distinctly disdainful manner that matched the tone he spoke with. Are you finally showing your true colors, Zaraki? Proving the world that you always were a beast in human form, and have now grown bored enough to slip free of your leash? Kenpeika grinned in amusement at that, and answered in a self-assured tone. Not at all, I'm just going to have a duel to the death with Jin, that's all. The huge man in the group opposing them let out a growl that didn't sound human at all, and shouted back, sounding affronted. How dare you? Attacking a fellow captain is a dishonorable break of Soul Society laws. Kenpeika didn't look intimidated at all, merely shrugging as he said. Not if they're a criminal in breach of those same laws themselves. The leader of the team didn't waver in keeping his sword pointed at Kenpeika, but his brows did furrow in something halfway between disbelief and confusion. If that's true, then you must have some proof of it, show it to us, and then we'll bring this to the captain commander so that proper justice can be delivered. Kenpeika stepped forward at that, shaking his head. No, I don't think so. If we do things your way, I won't get my fight. I'd much rather kill Jin first, and prove he was guilty afterwards. He brought a hand to his sword's handle and added, the beginning of a smile on his lips. Are you going to get in the way of that, Tuan? Tuan, if that was actually the man's name, scoffed as he said, hatred in his voice. So, as I expected, this is all an excuse to sate your bloodlust. We won't let you carry out such a miscarriage of justice. The time has come to put you down like the rabid dog you are. Kenpeika's smile grew in a wide, incredibly eager, and bloodthirsty grin at that, and he said, his sword sliding out of his scabbard. Start running, kids, and make sure to save Kukaki's sister and keep Jin there for me. It seems I'm going to get myself a little appetizer before I can taste the main course. Tatsuki didn't wait a moment, and immediately began running, soon joined by every member of their group bar Kenpeika, with Yumichika moving to the head of the group to lead them in the correct direction. Behind herself, she felt the med captain's riot so suddenly being released with enough power it almost felt like running away from an explosion, even as she had to ordering some of his flunkies to give chase and stop them. Her only answer to that was to accelerate their pace. They had no time to get wrapped up in a fight right now, they had Rukia to save. She could only hope they would make it there in time. Chapter 60, Assault. Ichigo watched his right arm with a frown as he flexed it, comparing the responsiveness of it with that of his left one, which was only covered by a thin film of almost invisible hollow reishi with liquid hollow ryotsu flowing underneath it, whereas the right one was almost 2.5 the size, and covered in the thick black fur of his hollow form. Then, he let out a long breath and addressed Shiro with his mind, since the current situation made it impossible for him to actually speak. And you're sure you're not trying to interfere with it at all? The hollow's answer was delivered in a disdainful tone with just the slightest undertones of anger. Of course I'm certain. Much as I'd enjoy your suffering if you were to die, I wish for revenge far more strongly, and it's clear I will only get it by working with you. The delay in the reaction is entirely due to the muscles themselves, not any interference on my part. Ichigo frowned, then focused the power of the Hujioku to once more manipulate the Ryatsu Shiro was supplying, so that both arms were back to the half-transformed state it have only been covered by the slight film of Ryatsu, flexing them again, before removing only the right arm to its completely natural, untransformed state and repeating the test, nodding to himself afterwards. So, the mask gives me 3 times the strength and speed of my base form, and the full hollow form gives me 3 times that, which is a 9 times increase over the baseline, but this is accompanied by a corresponding reduction of the muscles' responsiveness to my intentions, as it takes them 9 times as long to react to my will. The annoyance in Shiro's tone was even more pronounced at that. What does it matter? So what if your reflexes are worse, your movements are so much faster it won't matter in an actual fight? It would in a sword fight. A sufficiently skilled opponent can overcome superior strength with precision, and a gap in speed might not be enough to compensate for a lack of coordination, especially at very close range. Brute force isn't the solution to everything, Hollow. Zanjitsu's objection clearly let Shiro dissatisfied. For his own, Ichigo merely filed both opinions away. While he agreed with his Zanpakuto's position, it wasn't like the boons the Hollow would grant him were inconsequential either. As with everything else in his arsenal, they simply gave him more options, more alternatives to deploy should the situation call for them. With a long breath, he focused on a different exercise, extending the thin Ryatsu layer of the partial transformation to cover the awakened sword in his hand. Getsuga Tensho, as usual, offered no resistance to the process, even if, without the Hujioku, expanding his partially transformed visored status to something other than himself had proven impossible. With it, however, the awakened sword could be included in the effect easily, although whenever he ran the Hollow's Ryatsu over it, the sword drew it within itself before he could use it in any way. He tried once again to try and keep it from being absorbed, but even with the Hujioku letting him control the Ryatsu directly, the sword refused to let any stay outside the blade. Either he kept it from touching Getsuga, or the sword would trap it within itself. It was frustrating, but he consoled himself with the knowledge that the ability still had uses. When covered in the protective layer of hollow Reishi, the sword stopped absorbing loose Ryatsu from the air, but on the other hand, the Ryatsu already within stood still, instead of requiring him to focus on keeping it from exploding out. And, of course, he could flood the sword with Shiro's Ryatsu to have it charge in high-power attack much faster than waiting for it to simply absorb it from the air would. Additionally, while he couldn't charge that stored Ryatsu with emotions, as apparently Getsuga applied its own and overrode those effects to grant it instead the efficacy an attack with it would provoke, he could have Shiro purify the Ryatsu before it was absorbed, and when done that way, it retained the purified effect. Ichigo had not dared to test out the result, considering how dangerous that kind of attack could be, but if it worked the way he thought it would, that would turn Getsuga Tensho into his ultimate trump card. Despite that, and how useful the ability to achieve a status in between the masked one and the full release by using the Hujioku to only full release a small portion of his body actually was, the most effective use of the thing he had found was to enhance Zanjitsu. It hadn't been an easy process, but the results had been far more than worth it, in Ichigo's opinion. It had been obvious from the first try that, without Zanjitsu letting him, expanding the power of his hollow to cover the Zanpakuto would have been impossible. Even with the connection between them providing a bridge, the sword's spirit could repel the effect automatically, even when unaware. It only got through if the sword willingly allowed it to. That had been enough to prove that not even the Hujioku would allow a visored to spread their contamination to another person, which was somewhat comforting, even if it meant he could not use it in battle that way. Furthermore, even with both Shiro and Zanjitsu willingly cooperating, their essences almost instinctively repelled each other. That had been a sour discovery because, if the Ryatsu of the hollow was forced inside the Zanpakuto, like he normally would with his own to increase its size or density, it seemed to be immediately destroyed. The discovery of what was a potential way to completely purge the hollow from himself had left Ichigo momentarily stunned when he'd first made it, and thus, the eventual realization that such a thing wasn't actually possible in practice had been an enormous disappointment. Even with Shiro helping the process along to test it out, the hollow Ryatsu had resisted the combined effort of all three of them so much Ichigo had been left almost unconscious by it. The idea to force it to happen if Shiro were actively resisting the push was simply ludicrous. Besides, even if he might find it in himself to try later anyway, since sharing his soul with a monster wasn't Ichigo's idea of a good time, currently he needed his inner hollow's help. When merely covering Zanjutsu with the light coat of flowing Ryutsu that matched Ichigo's masked state, it practically gave him a second Ryutsu coat over his sword, that could be released at once for combined effects in a way that really expanded his range of options. And when he let the hollow Ryutsu condense into Reishi for the full transformation, not only did it allow Zanjutsu to, essentially, use it as fuel for using Hakuta himself, but he could use his Quincy powers to reshape the coating into a variety of shapes. It was very difficult to overstate the sheer utility that either option offered. Having both was simply too good of a boost to lose at this time. Of course, for how much power the Hujioku granted Ichigo, he needed it outside of the soul pocket Rukia had created for him to be able to use it. The process of calling it out or sealing it away was itself extremely simple, but he'd initially floundered on how to be able to wield both the roiling sphere of darkness and both of his swords at the same time. He wasn't proud that the current solution to the problem had come from Shiro, something which likely anybody could have guessed upon being told that it was to simply hold the Hujioku in his mouth, but if nothing else it was further proof that the Hollow really wanted to collaborate, for whatever the intentions of such a flighty creature could be worth. While the Hujioku had been the focus of most of his training, Ichigo had not forgotten to get a sense for how his Shikai worked. As it turned out, the ability was far more nuanced than he'd first understood it to be, with even Zanjutsu himself not having fully grasped what he was capable of. When he'd asked the Zanpakuto about this, he was told that, while the power was primarily provided by the sword, it was still partly derived from Ichigo's personality as well, which meant that the sword itself, despite knowing what it did, had not a full sense of everything it could be used for. It made sense to Ichigo, in the manner that a human might be able to float, yet not know he had the ability before actually entering the water, but it still raised some interesting question about where, exactly, the line between Zanpakuto and wielder precisely lie, and what its nature was, precisely. His musing, and last-minute training, were interrupted by a hand rapping on his shoulder, although to Ichigo it only felt like a single light tap, since everything around him which wasn't standing still he could only perceive as a blur. With a long breath, he gathered himself, steeling his expression, before cutting the purple band around his arm with Zanjutsu's blade, returning to experience things at normal speed, rather than the previous rate of 1 hour per minute he'd held to for his training. Even prepared for it, it still took him a moment to settle himself before he was able to turn toward Momo, to find the dark-haired girl frowning. I know it's handy for training, but it's still very unsettling to see somebody go from barely moving to suddenly acting normal right that, not that I meant to say you're unsettling. Ichigo shook his head at that, holding back a chuckle. It wasn't the first time Momo had ended up accidentally insulting people in the 2 days he'd spent here, and she always looked so distressed afterward it was clear it wasn't intentional. He returned both of his swords to their sealed state and sheathed them, then answered with a I know that seemed to settle her. Oh, that's good. So, the Lady Shihoin and Lieutenant Urahara say it's time to go. Ichigo nodded, following Momo as they moved away from the secluded area of the cave where he'd been training. As they did, she asked, the genuine curiosity that seemed to be her default state returning to her tone. So, did your training help you figure out anything new that might help? A few things, but I won't know if they'll actually help until I test them in battle. We're going to pulverize that arrogant bastard, now that I can fully add my strength to the context. Ichigo ignored Shiro's bragging, and instead asked Momo what of your work. Managed to create all that you needed, in hope the conversation would bore the hollow and keep it from bothering him. Momo, at least, seemed happy to elaborate on her work. Of course. Sewing the Reishi circuit for the stealth field in the Lady Shihoin's clothes in a manner that wouldn't interfere with her Shikai ability was an interesting challenge, but I managed to work it out. Then she glanced at him, suddenly worried as she added. Yours is still in working order, right? Ichigo ran his fingers over the stitched, incredibly complex pattern of black thread that had been sewn into his already black kimono, so that it could not be noticed with a random glance, only felt by actually touching the cloth. According to Momo's explanation, it allowed the clothes to cast a shell of Ryutsu around them, which captured light and could either rearrange it into a predetermined image, such as that of a particular person, or dissemble it to match the surroundings, granting a sort of invisibility. The shell was apparently easily broken by anything moving through it, including from the inside to the outside, and was a one-use only item, but until used, the reishi stored in it would hold itself in a ready state. According to Momo, for how long it could hold such a charge depended on the materials used, and what little Urahara had stored in his little hideout was not up to the quality Momo was used with having access to in her 12th Division laboratory, which was the reason for her worry. However, given that Ichigo could feel the reishi pulsating under his hands, it seemed to him that the effect was still holding up, and when he told as much to Momo, the girl let out a long, relieved breath. "That's good, I made yours first, so if it's still in working order, the others should be as well, since you spend more time training in slowed time than any of the rest of us." Once they reached the other two at the feet of the vertical tunnel that would lead them outside, Ichigo and Momo found that Urahara was waving happily, looking almost eager to go, while Yoriuki was merely looking thoughtful. The dark-skinned Shinigami focused her golden eyes on Ichigo as he arrived, even as her words were addressed to the entire group. "I hope you're ready to move, because Rukia is being escorted to the hill as we speak." That immediately made Ichigo tense, as he asked, anticipation in his voice. "Are we going to intercept her before she makes it there?" Yoriuki had mentioned that whether they would do this or not would depend on what sort of escort Rukia was under, but Ichigo was still convinced that striking in transit was their best bet. Thus, he was disappointed when Yoriuki shook her head. "It isn't feasible, while her escort is only 2 people, one of those is Kojiro Sasakaibe, and Jin is the other." Ichigo inhaled sharply at that, the memory of his last fight with Jin still very clear in his mind. He had had no chance at all against the man back then, but on the other hand, he had not had Zanjitsu's Shikai, Getsuga, Shiro's cooperation, any idea of what he could do with the Hujioku, nor the equivalent of almost 1 month of almost restless training in all of those techniques thanks to Urahara's help. This time, things were bound to go differently. Thus he asked, frowning. "We don't even need to defeat them both, just grab Rukia. Wouldn't it be better to strike now, than to wait for her to be dragged to the execution ground, where she'll be in the middle of the Shinigami guards?" Yoriuki shook her head grimly. "It's too dangerous, even if we could take them both, which isn't at all guaranteed, since Sasakaibe is as strong as a captain himself. The real risk is that Jin would take advantage of a moment of distraction to simply slit Rukia's throat in the middle of the fight. I don't see how any of that changes if we attack the execution grounds. Because once they're there, Sasakaibe will be keeping watch over Rukia to ensure that the proper procedures are followed, and would send Jin forward while he himself holds back to guard her, whereas in an attack during transport he would be distracted by the fighting, and thus Jin would have more freedom to do as he pleases." Ichigo wasn't sure how much he truly believed that, but he supposed he had to trust Yoriuki about the personalities of the Shinigami they were fighting, since she was the one who actually knew them personally. Still, he couldn't help himself from commenting, in an annoyed tone. "So we'll need to punch our way through the Shinigami surveillance cordon, after all?" That had been the plan if they couldn't spring Rukia during transit, and considering that 12 of the 13 captains, the medical squad's leader apparently having an exemption from attending due to a vow of some sort, were supposed to be in attendance for this kind of event, it was a daunting prospect, even with the plan they had come up with. Which was why he was surprised when Urahara butted in, happily. "Yes, but it might be much easier than we anticipated." "Really?" Yoriuki nodded, and explained. "For whatever reason, it seems that about half the captains are missing. The only ones there, outside of Sasakaibe and Jin, are Swaifon, Byakuya, Yadomaru and Odoribashi." Ichigo blinked, and Momo looked completely disbelieving as she asked. "Even Captain Yukitake and Captain Shunsui aren't there?" Yoriuki shook her head, then said. "Traditionally, the captain commander arrives half an hour after the process of powering up the Sokioku has started. To complete it, and while he has never had one, he is allowed an honor guard, so I suppose it's not impossible that the 2 of them will be accompanying with him. Tuan and Komamura are friends, so it's possible that they were coming together and something delayed them, and Mayuri is careless enough that I could see him forgetting so set an alarm or some such. As for Kenpeki, who has never missed an official execution since he joined the Godai, is absent too, that I can't answer." A sudden spark of hope rose in Ichigo's chest at that. "Do you think Tatsuki might have beaten him, wounded him badly enough he couldn't be there?" Yoriuki looked at him with clear disbelief in her eyes, and asked back. "Do you?" Ichigo had to admit, the idea of that monster being taken out was difficult to contemplate. Tatsuki had always been strong, but even Ichigo wasn't sure she was that strong. Still, this at least increased the chances that Tatsuki was, if not safe and sound, at least alive, which was more hope than he'd had the last 2 days. It wasn't like he'd tired himself off with punishing training times without reason, after all. Well, he was wounded, maybe she just managed to drag him into a long chase, or something. Does it matter? Everybody turned to Urahara, who said, in a decisive tone. They're not here, that's what we need to focus on now. Maybe they're just late, maybe they're dead, but all that matters is they're one less obstacle for us to take care on. It means things just got easier, we just need to make use of this new advantage. Yuriyuki blinked, then nodded. Right. The plan already called for Kisuke to set a perimeter of traps that we would draw the enemies into with a set of feints, but with the changed situation, I think having him focus on setting up a second layer of traps focused on capturing newcomers would be best. Plus, with such a smaller risk of interference, I can go all out from the onset, rather than needing to wait for at least a couple captains to have been ensnared by the traps first. She raised her finger in warning. Remember, when I draw their attention on me, you are to let Swaifon, and her alone, close in. She'll focus on me if you don't get in her way, and if any of you tried to help, that'd only make things harder for me and more dangerous for you. Ichigo frowned at that, this still seemed so strange to him. Isn't it Rukia's brother the one who outplayed you? Shouldn't he be the biggest threat? Yuriyuki shook her head. Byakuya might have surprised me, but however much he might have progressed in this century, he's still new to his power. Swaifon had already unlocked her Bankai before my exile, and even back then, when she had no real idea on how to use it, I would have rated it as by far the most destructive and lethal Bankai I have ever seen. It's not versatile at all, which is why I think others could be considered more powerful, but if she were to cut loose, nobody on that hill would be able to avoid destruction. The level of collateral damage it can cause is the only reason she generally doesn't like to use it. Ichigo had to frown at that. And yet, you seem confident you'll be able to tackle it and survive. Yuriyuki grinned, tapping her temple with a finger. Play the person, not the game. If I lure her into the park next to the hill, she will be able to cut loose with it, and considering how important it is for her to beat me, I know she will. But I'm faster than she is, so I can keep her pinned there, trying and failing to take me down, while you all free Rukia. A grimace formed on her face at that. It means I won't be able to contribute to the battle, but it'll keep the largest threat away from the battlefield, and give you the time you need to accomplish our objective. It's the smartest way to handle this. That said, she motioned for the ladder that was carved into the stone chute, concluding the briefing with a curt, "We've wasted enough time, let's just go." They did, ascending to the exit from the cave, which was in the basement of an abandoned house, and then climbed their way to the house's roof. Urahara had chosen the placement of the hiding place carefully, and from their position, the execution hill was clearly visible. While they were far enough, nobody was likely to notice their presence. Far enough, in fact, that Ichigo couldn't really make up too much of the details, other than the large crowd arranged in a circle around the hill's base, and the very large, flat, and circular hilltop marked with faintly glowing patterns on the ground, 2 steel pillars covered with complicated carvings standing tall in the very center of it all. Yuriyuki, however, had her golden eyes change slightly into those of a bird of prey, and after a moment she started to point and explain the distribution of forces. The group closest to facing us is made up mostly of 2nd and 6th Divisions members. I'll be taking those out first. The other side seems a mix of the 10th and 5th Division, neither is a significant threat, and other than their captains, most of them are too far to really interfere. She looked perplexed. There's less people than I expected, too, nobody from the 3rd and 8th, and next to nobody from the 11th, 12th, or 13th, which is weird. Urahara shrugged, as if to say that it was no problem. Should I go and start setting up my traps? Yuriyuki raised an hand, silently commanding for him to wait, and so they all did, until she finally said, in a self-assured tone as she motioned for Urahara to move. Now. The crowd are opening to let Rukia, Sasaki, and Jin through. It'll probably take about 10 minutes before they start the rituals, which is the moment we'll launch our attack. From that point, you're gonna have half an hour or so before Yamamoto shows up. She turned to look at the blonde Shinigami, who was stretching as if preparing to run a marathon, and added, in a very serious tone, we'll be depending on you to cover our retreat, so Kisuke? Do your worst. There was something manic in the scientist's grin that answered her command, saying count on it. As he pushed his green hat over his head and turned on the stealth modification Momo had sewn into it, disappearing from sight. Yuriyuki turned her attention back on their opponents, causing the rest of them to do the same, and even though Ichigo couldn't make out the individual faces, the group of 3 people making their way to the top of the hill was easy to track, due to being so isolated from the rest. Ichigo glanced impatiently toward Yuriyuki, who gestured for him to wait while one of the 3 figures was made to kneel between the 2 steel pillars, and another started to walk around the grounds, clearly checking the pattern on the grounds. He guessed that this was what Yuriyuki had meant when she said they would wait 10 minutes before starting. Seeing that Momo was just as impatient as himself, he asked the girl, in the hope of calming both of their nerves. What are they checking the pattern on the ground for? Even as she was still trembling with tension, it was clear that having to answer the question caused some of it to bleed away, as she explained in a whisper. For damage and tampering, mostly the former since they only use the execution grounds every few years. The latter is more of a formality, since the Sokyoku is pretty resilient, and other than making it take longer to recharge, any serious amount of damage would simply deactivate it immediately, and we'd know if it had been. To confirm everything is in working order is just the proper procedure. We can't see from here, but I expect the person on the pillars is checking them as well. Ichigo nodded, and was about to ask what the recharge time actually was, before his attention was suddenly drawn to an explosion of dust on the opposite side of the hill from where they were actually standing. He got to his feet, startled, and leaned forward to try and understand what had just happened. What's that? Did Urahara mess up something? Yuriyuki shook her head, a deep frown on her face. No, it's Dash. Her speech was interrupted as a titanic creature emerged from the cloud of dust, what looked like a huge, skeletal snake with a red mane that had Ichigo grinning as he completed for her, relief flooding him, Renji's Bankai. If he's here, despite having been captured, that means the others have to be as well. Yuriyuki nodded, getting to her feet herself as she barked, all right, change of plans, I'm going in right now. You two get ready to jump in as soon as I've dragged Swaifon away. I'll send up a signal when it's time for you to go. Make sure to keep the others out of my way until you're ready to go for the win in the way we planned. Then, without hesitation, she turned into a hawk and flew forward. She moved so fast Ichigo lost sight of her almost immediately, but it was clear when she struck, as almost 2/3 of the Shinigami in front of them seemed to disappear, even if he knew she'd just turned them all into some sort of harmless bugs. While he waited for the signal and chaos erupted among enemy lines as Yuriyuki's Bankai struck them again, Ichigo focused his Quincy powers, starting to draw Raishi under his feet to create a triangular platform similar to Orium's shields, working hard to make it as large and thin as possible. Meanwhile, next to him Momo muttered, "Snap," to Byakuya, releasing her Shikai. Even as most of his focus was on creating the platform they would soon need, Ichigo paid some attention to the girl's power being released. She'd explained him that, in its Shikai state, her Zanpakuto reacted more strongly to being fed more Ryotsu than most others would, and as she called it out, he could see that it was true. The blade was a straight, double-edged one with a jut-like prong about a hand past the hilt, and as Momo fed it more power, rather than simply growing longer or larger, the blade seemed to gain half again its length as well as a new prong, without any other changes. According to Momo, there was no real upper limit, but she fell to her knees after she'd made the blade about as long as she was tall and given it 5 prongs, a clear sign that going too far would exhaust her very quickly. You sure that wasn't too much? Momo quickly shook her head, getting back to her feet before answering with a smile. Don't worry, I can do it. I know my limits. Ichigo considered the possibility that she was just putting up a front against how the girl was generally very honest, but before he could think of a good way to frame the question without making it sound offensive, a bright flash of golden light came from the sky in front of them. Ichigo could just about see a single person chasing after somebody else headed toward the park, so he extended an arm to Momo, saying, "Come on, we need to go." The girl nodded, grabbing his arm as he dragged her over the thin platform he'd created. Ichigo had no idea how Uriah managed to move his platforms around with any amount of speed. All Ichigo could do with something so thin and larger than himself was keep it together and perhaps move the corners a bit. Luckily, that would be enough to steer it, so he summoned the Hujioku in his mouth, and then granted control of his left arm to Shiro as he morphed it into its full hollow form. He felt how the hollow let a blast of Ryotsu out from it, the acceleration brutal but survivable, and certainly enough to send the platform they were standing upon high in the sky, lifting off and accelerating like a plane. Ichigo and Momo both had to use Hakuta to stick to it, but they didn't fall, and between his steering and the hollow's propulsion, the result was that they were gliding forward fast. Just keeping them from plummeting was taking all of Ichigo's focus, so he knew he wouldn't be able to do much offensively even as they got closer and closer to the hill and the enemies around it. However, that wasn't a problem, as the moment they got into range, Momo took care of offense herself by swinging her sword to send 5 fireballs, each one larger than a person, into the crowds below, just as they had planned. Ichigo took notice of the fact that each fireball corrected its course independently to hit one of the few people on the ground who had managed to avoid Yoriuki's Bankai, a clear indication Momo didn't need to direct them personally. As soon as they hit their targets, each fireball exploded in a conflagration of smoke and flame, and Momo swung again and again, causing a veritable rain of flaming meteors to fall from the sky on their enemies below. Naturally, that couldn't go unchallenged for long, and in fact, it was but a moment after the ground began being littered with explosions that a huge swarm of steel petals took flight from the ground, glinting pink in the reflected light as it smashed into the latest hail of fireballs and made them explode, while the blade fragments themselves were only scattered from the impact, rather than destroyed. Ichigo didn't wait, drawing out Zanjutsu and making it just large enough for Momo to jump onto the flat of the blade. He used Hakuta to ensure she was sticking to it before he swung, growing the blade as long as he could while it was moving, transforming his arm so that Shiro's strength would make it possible for him to hold a blade almost 8 meters long, if only for a second. At the apex of the swing, when Momo was nearest to the ground, Ichigo then switched the code of the sword to repulsion, so the girl was flung forward rather than simply down, giving her both distance and a far softer landing trajectory to ensure she wouldn't be hurt upon hitting the ground. Of course, doing all that had resulted in him losing control of his improvised glider, which was now plummeting toward the ground, as well as on a collision course with the quickly reassembling blade petals in the air. But Ichigo was ready for that, sealing away the Hujioku and growling, "Learn, Zanjutsu!" to call forth his Shikai, while he simply willed the glider to explode as soon as he'd hardened his legs with Hakuta, propelling him forward so fast that he made it through before the blades could close on him, darting toward the ground. Which meant he was about to experience what it was like to smash into the ground from on high at a speed comparable to that of a cannonball. He quickly maneuvered Zanjutsu in front of him, the blade smashing into the ground first and, thanks to his Shikai's power, absorbing the terrifying blow back from the impact even as the ground around him broke because of it. For a moment, Ichigo was standing still in midair, the tip of his sword embedded into the earth, but gravity reasserted itself, and he landed nimbly on his feet, dragging Zanjutsu out of the dirt and bringing it to rest over his shoulder, feeling the blade brimming with the terrifying force the ground would have hit him with, stored and ready to use on his next strike. He looked around, past the cloud of dust he was surrounded by, taking in the surprisingly large and deep crater he was standing into, the very one he'd created smashing the ground in such a manner. He carefully searched for a possible threat taking advantage of the poor visibility to hide, but when he couldn't find any, he simply made his way out of it at a relaxed pace, mentally preparing himself for what he knew had to be waiting on the other side. And indeed, as soon as he exited from it, he was invested with the feeling of a disdainful Ryotsu coming from the waiting figure of a man with long black hairs held back atop his head by a white headpiece, with sharp features and cold gray eyes within that felt as cold as winter himself. Despite the dust floating around the battleground, his Shinigami uniform, the silver scarf he wore over it and the white haori draped over his shoulder were immaculate, with the flashes of pink light coming from the steel petals that seemed to float around him like a soft cloud making his unnatural cleanliness even more apparent. While he had a sword in his hand, an elegant and simple blade with lavender wrappings over its handle and a white crossguard shaped like the frame of a glassless 4-paneled window, his hold on it was relaxed, the blade pointing to the ground, and only the occasional small fragment of steel breaking away from the simple katana blade to join the others floating around him indicated that the weapon was in use. Due to the hill's incline, the man had the higher ground, which forced Ichigo to raise his chin to meet his gaze, and made the way he was looking down feel even more condescending. Byakuya. Rukia's brother didn't move to acknowledge Ichigo's greeting, instead studying him as he would a strange insect. Only after a pause long enough to make it clear he wasn't answering directly, merely expressing his own opinion, did Byakuya speak, in a tone that perfectly matched both his expression and the feeling in the riot so that was oppressively flowing out of him. Ichigo Kurosaki. That is your name, correct? Or were the reports wrong? Ichigo scoffed, not removing his eyes from the man for a moment to be ready for it whenever he decided to attack, and answered. Yeah, that's me. What of it? Why are you here? For a moment, Ichigo could feel anger overtaking him at the sheer gall of this man, but Zanjutsu immediately siphoned some of it away, which let him keep his cool, and, he noticed interestingly, caused Byakuya's eyes to narrow ever so slightly, as he answered with a grin. I'm here to save Rukia, what else? Then he pointed his Zanpakuto at him and added, his voice hardening. So you better get out of my way, because if I have to go through you to do it, I will. In that moment, all of Ichigo's doubts had disappeared, and he felt like he was ready to either win, or die trying. Check the description for the links to the author.